and waste, and also remote sensing and satellite imaging as well.
Thank you. And Stefan, you alluded to a number of organizations that are doing this sort of assessment. I'm wondering if the other panelists might be able to speak to the role of these other organizations in assessing environmental damage both during and after conflict.
Indeed. Following up on what Stefan said, there are two aspects relating to fact-finding concerning environmental damages. The first question is who did what? Who pulled the trigger? Which then also relates to criminal law. And the other thing is, the other aspect is, what is the environmental impact? Where is the environmental problem? How can we evaluate environmental damage? So the effect, and both aspects are important. And we need fact-finding on both aspects. Now, coming to the practice, Stefan already mentioned a very important point, and this is civil society organizations who are doing fact-finding, mainly on their own initiative. In relation to the Ukraine conflict, we've had such fact-finding in the Donbas area, where since 2014, the environment is heavily damaged. And I admire some of those activists who did fact-finding at the risk of their life. So I think this is a very important point. The NGOs, civil society organizations, acting on their own initiative. But on the other hand, there are governmental organizations, and Stefan represents one of them, perhaps the most important one, but there are others. When we get closer to the humanitarian aspect, it's the United Nations Human Rights Council or the Office of the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs. We have already in place a mission by the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE was just submitted. I have read recently a report. There's a 3-person commission. I have not yet seen that report, but this is an important aspect. So there is a diversity of organizations which are involved. And I think there is no point of centralization. Different organizations have different potentials, and they should all go ahead. This brings me to a last point, because you mentioned my former capacity as chair of the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission. That is an institution set up by the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. So there's a treaty-based body which has the task, if asked by the parties, to inquire any violation of international humanitarian law, and that, of course, includes causing environmental damage which is unlawful under international humanitarian law. That commission, I'm no longer part of it, but I know it, has offered its services to the parties to the conflict. So far, I haven't heard of any reactions to this offer.
Thank you, Michael. And Jose, would you like to share some of your experiences from the UNCC?
Sure. Certainly, as a commissioner with the UNCC in evaluating claims for environmental damage resulting from the invasion and occupation of Kuwait, one of the central issues that we needed to grapple with was the question of the baseline. What was the baseline prior to the environmental damage that was caused by the conflict? And in that context, the importance of having good monitoring and assessment being able to measure the increment of damage and be able to prove that increment of damage becomes very, very important to any compensation that might be provided for that damage. For some areas, it's going to be obvious that the change in baseline that occurred. You have an urban area with apartment buildings, office buildings, and now it's been reduced to rubble. It becomes more difficult when you're dealing with areas that have been previously heavily industrialized, perhaps contaminated from those prior historical industrial activities, and there it becomes more challenging to establish the baseline and evaluate the increment of damage, but it's no less important to do.
Thank you, Jose. And that's a great segue to the next question, which is shifting gears from impacts to action. And the question is, what can be done about the environmental impacts? I think there are two broad categories. One is environmental remediation and containing the damage, and then restoration, and then questions of liability. And I'd like to focus first on the containment and remediation of environmental damage. Stefan, UNEP has, for now more than 2 decades, worked to restore the environment in conflict-affected countries. Based on your experience, what are the priorities for environmental recovery in Ukraine, and what are the typical patterns of post-war environmental reconstruction that we tend to see?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer because we're still in what is an active conflict at the moment, and it's a continuing conflict. So at this stage, it's difficult to kind of identify any specific priorities. At the same time as well, is that what we've seen is, as has been mentioned, a heavily industrialized society, which has undergone sustained heavy attacks. We've seen significant urban damage. There's a significant problem with unexploded ordnance, damage to industrial facilities, chemical storage facilities, extractive sites, deforestation, impacts on agricultural land. And I think all of this, we've seen a large scope of various themes, and perhaps components of themes that we've seen in other places all around the world, but perhaps all wrapped into one country, and with quite a challenging and large geographical scope as well. So I think one of the issues, rather than at this stage talking about priorities, is to really highlight the extensive scope of damage and the extensive geographical scope of the damage that has taken place. I think in terms of priorities, I think obviously it's maintaining a very robust monitoring process from all of these partners, making sure that assessments are done quickly, accurately, and of high quality. And this is really the priority of this has to make sure that any recovery efforts, and even when thinking forward to reconstruction and redevelopment planning, is to make sure that this is founded on solid baselines and accurate baselines as well, so that the reconstruction efforts don't actually exacerbate some of the environmental problems. And I think this has been the case in many conflicts before, is that environmental recovery work or hazard remediation tends to be a little bit quick and dirty to some extent. The environmentalists tend to come into the show perhaps a little bit late, and then it goes back to business as usual, which is very carbon intensive and very destructive as well.
Thank you. Jose, would you like to share a few perspectives from the UNCC experience?
Certainly. I think that for the international community, a focus on providing financial support for monitoring and assessment and restoration efforts are as important as providing financial support for economic recovery or infrastructure rebuilding. And that needs to be part of any international effort that is made, is to ensure that there's adequate funding. I mean, one of the issues that we faced with the UNCC is the question of providing early funding so that affected governments did have the capability of carrying out the monitoring assessment, because if you're going to make a claim for compensation and you don't have the ability to establish the nature of the damage and extent of damage that you've suffered, your claim is probably not going to proceed or succeed. So you have to make sure that the funding is there to enable the affected entities to undertake the necessary assessment and ultimately the remediation that becomes necessary afterwards.
Great points. And I'd like to shift now to the question of accountability. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how it's undertaken the war generated widespread agreement that Russia has violated numerous provisions of international law. The challenge, though, is how to hold Russia and the relevant leaders accountable. Usual mechanisms such as the UN Security Council, which was instrumental in holding Iraq liable for environmental and other damage arising from the 1990-91 invasion of Kuwait, are problematic because Russia holds a veto power. So, to the panel, what can countries in the international community do to hold Russia and its leaders civilly or criminally accountable for the environmental harms associated with this invasion? Michael, would you like to start?
Well, this is a great field. I'll try to describe the various aspects, one over the other. Let me start with criminal responsibility of individuals involved in the commission of crimes. The essential crime that has to be said in the beginning is attacks on the civilian population, which can be targeting civilians in the first place, which is a war crime, or by attacking military objectives, causing disproportionate damage to the civilian population. And both aspects involve protection of the environment. The environment is essentially civilian, and damaging the environment in this context is a war crime for that reason. Now, coming to war crimes, we first think, and that has already been mentioned, of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction on war crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine, regardless of the fact that Russia is not a party to the ICC statute. This is different as regards the crime of aggression, which would involve a duty to pay damages for anything which follows. But this crime of aggression requires that the state of the perpetrator is a party to the conflict. Now, the International Criminal Court has started an investigation concerning the situation, but the second very difficult problem is to single out specific suspects, which is also a question of fact-finding, and I understand the organizations doing fact-finding are aware of this problem, and from time to time one reads information that this is going on. The ICC is not the only institution which is entitled to prosecute war crimes. On the basis of universal jurisdiction, any state is entitled to do that. And I know that in a number of states, not only in the state of the victim, Ukraine, of course, but also in a number of states, and this includes Germany and Switzerland, there are investigations going on. Wherever this ends is difficult to know, but if I could give advice to Russian officers, be careful where you travel. You may be caught in a state which has an attentive prosecution. Now, turning to the question of reparation of damages. This is difficult as there is no international court which has jurisdiction on the matter. There is, of course, one precedent, which is the US-Iranian Claims Tribunal, which had the task of sorting out the consequences of the hostage-taking case. This requires an agreement, but I think it's not entirely unrealistic, because after a while both parties might find an interest in clarifying the consequences of this war, including the consequences of sanctions on one side or
Michael,
the other.
Michael, we're running a little short on time.
Yes, sure.
Wondering if I'd like to shift for a moment on the civil liability to Jose and his experiences with the UNCC.
Well, certainly. Look. The critical issue is, where's the money going to come from? It's one thing to assert and to establish that the aggressor is liable for damages. The other question is well, how are you going to get access? I do think, given the issues that you pointed out, Carl, with trying to establish some kind of international tribunal now, similar to the UNCC, I think the use of foreign assets that are held by national governments provides a mechanism for there to be a fund available to pay compensation. To my mind, though, the critical thing is that whatever form any tribunal takes, it needs to be one that is efficient, speedy, and fair. We don't know what that's going to look like at the end, but it seems to me that those are the key features that have to be in place. The Iranian Claims Tribunal, while important, became very protracted and is still very protracted because of the elaborate procedures that were involved. So I think looking forward, we need to make sure that whatever we do can operate efficiently and quickly and get compensation to the victims and affected governments as quickly as possible.
Michael, do you want to have a quick rebuttal or follow on, particularly as it relates to frozen assets?
I entirely agree that the money is there, but access to that money poses some questions of sovereign immunity, because this is state money, and normally this is protected by the rule of state immunity. Now, there are recent developments that's worthwhile inquiring into that in this case, where the consequences of a violation of fundamental norms of international law are at stake, it is possible to argue that in this case, the duty of states to put an end to a violation of imperative norms of international law takes precedence over the traditional rule of state immunity. But there is a legal fight which has to be fought.
Thank you. And Irina, I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on what the Ukrainian government is thinking about or doing in this area, criminally or civilly.
So Ukrainian government in a civic law is collecting all the information and recording all the cases to be able to put it in the International Court of Justice. In terms of environmental damage, that's, as I learned today, also many more information, and thank you for sharing these ideas, but we also have challenges in understanding how to assess what kind of methodologies use. We have challenges to quickly assess some sites because the war is ongoing and it's not always that we have access to the places. But we also see that the scale of impacts in Ukraine and the international legal system in place doesn't really fit. So we have to work together to find out new legal developments, to be able to resolve this also for the hopefully not existing future cases, but also that Ukraine becomes precedent of bringing environmental damages, like making aggressor accountable also for environmental damages. And very much looking forward to cooperate with all of the international organizations, scientific organizations, legal organizations to help us on this process.
I'd like to close by asking each of you, in one sentence, a short sentence, what should be the priorities of Ukraine and the international community in addressing environmental damage caused by Russia's invasion? Stefan.
Okay, so I'll try and be quick. I think, look, the scale of the destruction that we're seeing is so big, and that in itself presents a challenge of perhaps almost dealing with a blank slate. And I think the overall message is that I think everybody needs to think big. The political will for positive recovery is clearly there in Ukraine. There is a requirement to support that. They need to think beyond just making Ukraine safe again and just really start to think big. Imagine the national, the regional, the global potential of a green economic recovery.
That was a long sentence. Well done. Michael, you.
Well, credible and reliable fact-finding will be key. Second sentence, there is a task for the international community at large, a duty of solidarity, providing help, which means finance and expertise, which is there around the world and should concentrate on restoring the environment of Ukraine.
Thank you. Jose.
I have a very short sentence. I echo Stefan's and Michael's comments. I think those are the key priorities that we need to focus on. Two sentences, sorry.
Irina?
Ukrainian people, and it was also stated by the president and by the government of Ukraine, we want to have the green recovery, to build it on the low carbon and green technologies. So we would very much appreciate cooperation on expertise and on financial support to make it possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for sharing your expertise today. This is a critically important issue from Ukraine to Yemen to Colombia to Myanmar and many other countries. I thank those who are watching the show for taking time to be with us here today. And Washington, back to you.
Thank you, Carl. And thank you to our speakers for having this conversation. Irina, please stay safe. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with our global audience today. Much appreciated. And thank you to Kathleen Rogers and earthday.org for co-hosting today's DC program with us. Moving on, we are going to now turn from the impacts of war to the impacts of agriculture on our planet's health. Please note for this next segment, we will leave time for question and answer from the audience, so please use the chat function to ask questions to our moderator, who will direct them to the appropriate panelist. It is my pleasure to now introduce the moderator for this session, Jillian Seaman. Jillian is VP of Sustainability and former Director of Food and Environment at Earth Day Network. She is also a former appointee in the Obama administration, where she oversaw the creation and implementation of government initiatives that focused on sustainable agriculture in food deserts and disadvantaged communities. Jillian, thank you for being here. Over to you.
Thank you, Sheta. Thank you, everyone. Happy Earth Day. I would just like to say that, regenerative agriculture has the power to change the world. But agriculture especially is really facing a trifecta of potentially devastating challenges. And what we're seeing in regards to soil capacity, development, and other factors, some experts are predicting that we have less than 60 harvests left, which is quite scary to think about. And when we think about how we're going to feed the world, how we're going to feed ourselves, regenerative agriculture has that promise to not only feed the world, but to really mitigate the climate crisis that we're in. So we want to get into a great discussion with an extremely talented group of experts who will all introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what they are doing and how they are literally changing the world and really focusing on human and planetary health. So we will start with John Piatti, who is the president and CEO of American Farmland Trust, and it's so lovely to see everybody. Thank you for being here. Really excited about the discussion today. John, we can kick it off with you.
This panel. It is a great panel, and I think we're going to have a great conversation. Earth Day really helps the public focus attention on the planet's health, and I'm so glad to be talking about food and farm issues because they're critical, and yet I feel maybe because they're right under our nose and in our mouths every day, they're kind of overlooked at times, which is really too bad. The organization that I run, American Farmland Trust, was created 42 years ago and was created really because there was a void that needed to be filled. There was no other national group at that time operating in this space, viewing agriculture and the environment as inseparable, as what we sometimes refer to as two sides of the same coin. We've come a long way in the last 40 some odd years to a point where farmers and environmentalists are no longer at loggerheads as they were. And now environmental groups view farmers as partners, and many farm groups, even many very conservative farm groups, recognize the importance of environmental farming practices. So we've come a long way, and part of Earth Day is celebrating how far we've come. And yet on these issues of food and farming and their relation to the health of the planet, and particularly the climate crisis, we are in a very challenging time, and there's so much work ahead of us. American Farmland Trust is a relatively small organization, about 150 employees, but we've had an outsized impact on both farmland protection and regenerative practices. We've done a lot of this work sort of behind the scenes, if you will. We're not really a public name. Some people know our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker, and I always carry one with me, so here it is. But they don't know much about the organization behind it. And we're really a unique organization in many ways. In one way is that we approach public policy. We've done a lot of policy work at both the state and the federal level. And we approach it in a more comprehensive manner than some other policy groups. We've always had a strong research arm, and we try to use science and data to drive policy. And we also do a lot of work in the field. We get our hands dirty, and we think that's really critical to have credibility to talk to policymakers. Beyond this, we're also somewhat of a unique organization in that we look rather holistically at three interconnected issues. One is the land itself. We feel very strongly that we need that land not only to grow food, but to provide a whole range of environmental services. The second are the practices that occur in that land. And then the third are the people, the farmers and ranchers who do the work. Because if they can't make a living, and if we can't attract the next generation of farmers onto the land, we're not going to have anyone to follow the best practices that we need. So for us, it's really this holistic approach of land, practices, and people. And many people know American Farmland Trust work in one area, but don't know the other. I'll take just a moment to speak about our work. On the farmland protection side, for a lot of people, this is really what they associate AFT with, and for good reason. We really undertook the pioneering projects to use agricultural conservation easements in this country, and then we helped catalyze the creation of 29 state farmland protection programs, a number of land trusts, and of course the federal farmland protection program. And that's adds up to about 7 million acres of farmland that we've permanently protected. A great success, but not nearly what is needed. We've slowed the rate of farmland conversion considerably in the last 40 years, from about 3 million acres a year to about 750,000 acres a year that are being converted to non-farm use. That also is a success. But every acre we lose is a shame. It's irreplaceable land that, as I said, is not only needed for food, but to provide a whole range of services. The second area that we've been so effective and active in is with regenerative practices itself. Because if you're protecting the land, but the topsoil is washing into the rivers, if the farming practices are polluting the landscape, you're not really serving an environmental goal. So from the very beginning, AFT has also had a huge focus on this, again, often behind the scenes. We created the coalition that came together to form the 1985 Farm Bill, which was the first to include a conservation title. And that and all of the subsequent refinements to programs like CRP and EQIP that some of you may be familiar with. Those all began as AFT white papers, and those have really made a big difference. Again, a combination of demonstration projects and research and effective advocacy. But when we started working on those practices now almost 40 years ago, we were really thinking about soil health from the perspective of making sure that the land was more productive, that erosion would be reduced, that water would be retained. We really weren't thinking of carbon sequestration per se, but the same practices, any practice that builds soil health by definition is grabbing atmospheric carbon and putting it back into the soil. So we've been in this space for a long time, but it was probably only about a dozen years ago that we started to really specifically apply our work to the climate crisis. And at the federal policy level, the real first step in this regard to link climate and agriculture was the Waxman-Markey bill of 2008 and 2009. And it passed in the House. AFT had a huge role in that. But sadly, it failed in the Senate. And that really was a huge setback. And we probably haven't seen or didn't see a response to that until a few years ago. I would say that there was a period of dormancy in federal policy around this issue of climate and ag. And the change probably came, there are several factors, we could talk about that in more detail, but I think the change really came in around 2018. And one of the key factors was one of the IPCC reports that came out that year. And what it said quite clearly is that as critically as important as it is to reduce our carbon emissions, that alone will not get us to the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. We also have to take atmospheric carbon and trap it in our soils. So there was a bit of a sea change. It was wonderful for an organization like American Farmland Trust that's been proposing and pushing and promoting regenerative practices for so long here we're policymakers and members of the public and businesses. Increasingly, we're working with companies like Danone and General Mills and Land O'Lakes and others who really earnestly see the value of their farmers following better practices. So it's been a bit of a sea change, but boy, do we have a lot further to go. I think of just one benchmark, cover crops. I think about 6% of the farmland in this nation that could be under cover crops is currently farmed that way. Our research shows that U.S. agriculture could not only be carbon neutral, but could be a carbon sink. And we could be helping offset other economic sectors that potentially can never get there. So this is, in my mind, the critical issue of our times. And it's great to be on a panel with many other kindred spirits who are working towards the same goal.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you for the work that American Farmland Trust is doing. Hunter Lovins, who needs no introduction, but is the president of Natural Capital Solutions. Hunter, over to you.
Thanks so much. John mentioned the ability of soil to take carbon out of the air. This potential is enormous if we farm using regenerative agriculture. And we know how to do this. Farmers are starting to do this because it's more profitable. The way they're farming now, industrialized, mechanized, chemicalized, imposes costs. Eliminate those or reduce them, you cut your costs. This is why the farmer Gabe Brown in North Dakota helped invent this approach to regenerative agriculture. He was going broke. He said, I'll try anything. First, he went to no-till. He stopped breaking the soil, which decarbonizes, denitrifies it. Then he said, how do I get nutrients? How do I deal with all these plants coming in? He planted cover crops, then deep-rooted diverse cover crops. Now his fields are covered with all these cover crops, so he turned out his cows. The cows ate down the cover crops, fertilized the soil. Over about 20 years, he went from a little under 2% soil organic matter to, on average, 11%, some of his fields as high as 15%. Every 1% increase in soil organic material is 5 to 10 tons of carbon per acre and 20,000 gallons of water holding capacity. Why does General Mills, which John mentioned, have these principles as the basis of their regenerative agriculture? They hired Gabe. Oh, and Gabe is now profitable. He's rolling climate change backward at a profit. Fast forward to India, where the Green Revolution failed, imposed enormous costs on poor farmers who were then killing themselves, literally drinking their pesticides, which they couldn't afford, and killing themselves. A man named Vijay Kumar started working particularly with women in the villages on farms of an acre or less, taking Gabe Brown's principles. Now, they don't eat the cows there, but they use the cows for the manure, for the urine, mix it, and create a mycorrhizal inoculant, a fungal inoculant that jumpstarts the ability of the soil to mineralize carbon, which holds the water, which provides the nutrient space for the crops. They've gone from planting once a year, just before the monsoons, which with climate change are now becoming unreliable, to 3 plantings a year. So they have tripled their income. They no longer use poisons of any sort. They're healthier, their families are healthier, their communities are healthier. Vijay calls this community-managed natural farming. In India, Million Belay calls it agroecology. Same difference. Million has shown how in Africa, this approach of regenerative agriculture can deliver the promise that the Gates Foundation failed to do. They said, oh, we'll go with the Green Revolution, we'll double production. No, they didn't. Million has, and it's cheaper for the farmers, it's healthier for the farmers. This is an approach that is increasingly being practiced around the world, can make farm communities healthier, more prosperous, and solve the climate crisis when coupled with renewable energy. Yes, we have to stop emitting fossil carbon, but we also have to soak the excess carbon out of the air. Rodale Institute has shown how to do this with vegetables, with row crops. Savory Institute has shown how to do this with regenerative grazing. We've heard on this program, oh, we have to eat less meat. No, we don't. We have to eat less industrial meat. We have to eat more grass-fed meat because it's the action of the cattle, the goats, the sheep, the grazing animals on the ground that is pulling the carbon out of the air. If you don't believe me, read a paper by Greg Retallack, who shows how this is how the Earth decarbonized itself when we were at 1,000 parts per million concentration. Well, we weren't here. This is pre-humans. What got the Earth's concentration of CO2 down to the point where humans could evolve at 280 parts per million were grazing animals. We can replicate this through biomimicry, Janine Benyus's great approach of behaving in the way that nature does. And again, when we do this, we're dramatically more profitable. What can you do? I mean, you may not graze cattle, sheep. You can eat. Eating is an agricultural act, as Wendell Berry put it. What you buy, from whom you buy, matters a lot. Support your local farmers who are making this transition to regenerative agriculture. And this is what we're doing here in Colorado, working with Anthony, whom you'll hear from in a minute, and working with local farmers as part of the Colorado Regenerative Recovery Coalition, a group I helped create, to pull together hundreds of Coloradans to listen to them about what do you want coming out of the pandemic. Let's build a regenerative Colorado, not go back to the old normal that was broken. And let's do it with farmers and ranchers and people who live in apartments in the cities and businesses and industry by pulling all of us together to identify our priorities, to set forth policy. So we're working with state legislators. Our citizen engagement elicited thousands of ideas of how to build a regenerative Colorado, which we then embodied into bits of legislation, working with the politicians. It's now being implemented in Colorado through the Colorado Department of Agriculture, which is working with Anthony, and through communities across the state who are asking themselves, what kind of a world do we want to live in? Let's build a regenerative future. And when we do, we will achieve real sustainability, shared prosperity on a healthy planet.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Merlin, over to you. It's so good to see you. I'm assuming you're in Iowa.
I am in Iowa, and that's why I wore my John Deere hat, so that nobody would have a mistake as to where I was at.
Well, thank you for being here, and please introduce yourself and what you are doing with Regen Iowa and Blue Planet Science Group.
Okay, happy to do that. And I could not think of two better people to follow than Hunter and John. I've been following Hunter for 40 plus years. While I grew up in Iowa and got an education degree here. And by the way, this is my 52nd anniversary of being involved with Earth Day. Because in 1970, my senior year in college, Earth Day began. And on our campus at the University of Northern Iowa, we did an event, and I was proud to be there and proud to know that it was a Midwest person that it had sponsored and come up with this whole idea. So here we are 52 years later. You know, now taking it to a whole nother level, I do believe. In following Hunter and John, with Regen Iowa, we are regenerative agriculture in action. I left Iowa shortly after college, moved to Colorado, which is how I met Hunter and spent 40 plus years in the Boulder, Denver area. And then started coming back to Iowa a little over 10 years ago to work and educate with the governor in education reform, and then the Healthy Estate Initiative that was launched, and then water quality. And as I got involved in these things, and first of all, when I first went back to Iowa 40 plus years later, I almost did not recognize this state because agriculture had changed so much. And I was, quite frankly, was set back by what I went back to, was not happy with it. I'm still not happy with it, which is why I formed Regen Iowa with a number of fellow Iowans, and we've said enough is enough. We want to accomplish the things that Hunter was just describing, actually grow food, not just corn and soybeans, and grow food for our communities that has nutrition in it, and actually can provide the nutrient value that we have lost in our agricultural today for a lot of the reasons here again that Hunter mentioned on. When I started looking at the issues that Iowa was facing and realizing our issues are no different than any other state in the Midwest or across the country, I realized that we didn't really have an ag problem or a healthcare problem or an education problem. We had a systems problem. And until we started to address that system, I saw us take 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. So Regen Iowa is really a systemic approach that starts with water, soil, food, and ag, includes healthcare, education, energy, economics, and policy making. We have to have some serious policy making changes in the state to incentivize the farmers to do the right things so that we can get there. But the great thing about Iowa is that we're roughly 1% of the country. And I believe if we can address the many issues that we're going to talk about on this panel in Iowa, then we are a model for the rest of the country. And we've already started reaching out to Colorado. We're going to join them in a partnership with Regenerative Ag. We've got people in Missouri, Minnesota, Nebraska, Illinois that want to join us. So we're hoping to put together a global coalition, if you will, that literally starts in the heartland and in the Midwest to do all of the things that we need to do and to transition into this bold new world that we're evolving into. One of the people that I met recently is going to follow me, I think, in the next presentation, and that's Elizabeth Pierce. I found her, I'm not sure where we actually first met, but when I saw what she was doing with soil biology and where we were headed with Regen Ag, I said, we have got to work together because you've got the solution that we need in Iowa to rebuild our soil, get that biology healthy, and then sequester the carbon. Here again, as both John and Hunter was talking about, at a deep level so that it doesn't end up back in the air, but it actually helps grow the food into the nutrition that we have. So with all of that, I'm delighted to be here, and I will let it go to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Merlin. And you've done my job. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you. I'm the founder of SimSoil, and we are providing the biological solution for Regen Iowa. And Regen Iowa, as a nonprofit, has a goal of converting 1 million acres of farmland that is currently in conventional and agrochemical farming to regenerative agriculture. And if we can succeed in doing that and proving that it works, then we can move very quickly. You know, Iowa is the second largest state in the country in terms of food production, and 1 million acres for Iowa is about 7.8% of the total corn farmland that they have. Let me step back for a moment and just talk about SimSoil. We're focused on the complete soil ecosystem. That's how in nature the plants get the nutrient cycling that they need. Some think of it as the plants actually farm the soil microbes that are going to provide them with the nutrients that that they need the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, and other elements as well by absorbing those from the soil and then reprocessing them in a way that the plants can then absorb into themselves. The soil system is incredibly complex. It's got enormous biodiversity. There are in excess of 20,000 species in a handful of healthy soil. If you were to take all of the soil biology in 1 acre of land that's healthy, you'd have biology that had the same weight as 2 full-grown elephants standing upon the soil. In a lot of circles, this is called the soil food web. More recently, people call it the soil microbiome. Very similar in terms of its components to the gut biome. So there's a lot of information coming out about this. But the essence of what we care about is that the microbes leave behind the carbon that they have incorporated in the course of their life. That's actually how carbon sequestration happens. And if you listen to people talk about compost and you talk about ag biologics and a lot of the other information that's out there, they're focusing just on the bacteria. But there's actually 9 different types of life, and it's fungi that actually sequesters the majority of the carbon, and it's fungi that is the key to fertility. It's the fungi, the protozoas, the beneficial nematodes. Those are what's impacted by no-till farming. That's why no-till farming works. So the ranchers are ahead of the farmers in terms of this. They've seen that if you shift the soil biology, you increase the protein in the grasses. Alan Savory's done some wonderful work in this area. The plants have biodiversity, and that increases the types of foods that are out there and therefore the types of biology. SimSoil and Regen Iowa are focused on talking to Iowa farmers about improving their profitability, because until you increase their profitability, you're not really going to get them to move. So the carbon credits, the credits for soil biodiversity, the grants related to drought tolerance that are in California, SimSoil started in California, all of those are great at helping move the profitability of farmers. Our key message is lower input costs and the same or better yields and better nutrient density and better flavor, and that creates greater profitability. Where SimSoil is unique is we have developed ways to grow this complete ecosystem at industrial scale. And this is based on wild source biology. This is based on regionally specific microbiome, and we can develop crop-specific solutions based on the local biology. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I love the synergy and the commitment from this panel. And to round out this incredible panel, we have Anthony, who's the Executive Director and co-founder of Zero Foodprint. Anthony, welcome. Really excited to hear you talk about how Zero Foodprint is really mobilizing the food world around agricultural climate solutions. Over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Jillian, and thanks to the Alliance Center. So we've heard a lot about the solutions from the leaders on this panel, and I think basically I'm trying to present the plan to kind of operationalize those solutions and turn regenerative agriculture into the new normal. Because of the global audience, I'm going to kind of answer conceptually first. So imagine if every food company or every government had been taking care of the soil for the last 8 decades. Hundreds of gigatons of emissions would still be stored as healthy soil biology, according to the biogeochemists. We'd have nutrient-dense food, ample clean groundwater, we'd have resilient, thriving communities. And this is why, since first learning about regenerative agriculture, I basically have personally just gone all in. I'm going to spare you the whole life story today, but basically it's so optimistic and so plausible that I think it's the biggest opportunity in food and climate, because we can turn back the clock. These costs have been externalized, but we can internalize them. And it's going to happen one company and one government at a time, large or small. It's going to be good for business and also contribute to community prosperity. So it's basically one big fat win-win-win, just waiting for the right incentive structure and policy frameworks to scale. And I think Zero Foodprint is trying to implement those. So we lead public-private collaborations, as Hunter mentioned with the Colorado Department of Ag. also with the California Department of Food and Ag, regional governments like the City of San Francisco, Boulder County, City of Denver, and dozens of leading businesses to scale regenerative agriculture. And basically, we make it possible for an individual or a business or an organization to use $1 or $100,000 to make direct change in the field. So regenerative ag to me is the best example of global impact through local action. And the change is going to occur one field at a time, 1 acre, one practice, $1 at a time. In an aggregated food economy, though, there are so many layers of corporate extraction that the idea of a consumer voting with their dollar almost feels impotent. You know, the idea of supporting the good farmer, the regenerative farmer, there's no supply. But people and organizations want change, and they'll pay for change. According to some research, 70% of consumers will pay 35% more for the sustainable choice. So we're out there buying the good stuff, hoping change will occur. But because it's only a weak trickle-down kind of pull mechanism mediated by shareholder earnings, change is really slow. And for example, organic is just 1% of US farmland after 50 years. And so as society is embracing and maybe even relying on regenerative agriculture, we're saying we need to find a new way. And so instead of farm to table, Zero Foodprint is starting a table to farm movement. It's a strong but affordable push mechanism, and it enables direct change in the field. And so a good analogy would be in renewable energy. You know, there's a lot of work to be done, but there's been rapid progress in the last decade. Instead of kind of begging one business at a time or one homeowner to install rooftop solar, or instead of just buying products that are made with renewable energy, entire cities and counties are committing to shift to 100% renewable energy. And it's simple. You know, citizen sends $5 a month on the energy bill, something like that, whatever the program involves in that region, and it directly creates the change in energy production. So my message today is basically that a huge corporation or an entire county or state can commit to 100% regenerative agriculture. We can improve the grid of food. But of course, the question is how. So Zero Foodprint is making this real. We're already working with local governments, local soil experts, and businesses to make this kind of transformative change. Improving the grid is possible, it's plausible, it's even radically scalable. So last year, we also launched affiliate programs in Asia, Denmark, and Germany, and started farm projects in Colorado. We're going to expand to Georgia and the Northeast this year. And what we do is basically coordinate locally focused regenerative economies that can use even just a penny from a purchase. We aggregate those pennies into a fund, and then that's enough for a $20,000 compost project or to plant $10,000 worth of trees or cover crops. You know, basically based on whatever projects have the most climate benefit for that region. Dozens of stakeholders and carbon experts came together to create a system for this kind of optimal and equitable selection of projects, improving the grid. And we even have ordinances ready for local policymakers to level up the programs from a few businesses opting in to everyone having an opt-out. So basically, we can include tiny but crucial fees for regeneration across the entire economy. You know, imagine if $1 per month on the trash bill was going to regenerative ag, or 1% on your Amazon or McDonald's purchase, you know, generating billions of dollars per year to change acres. The big global climate research like Project Drawdown finds that 1% of GDP redirected toward the best solutions would be enough to lower global temperatures. So to put that another way, going from 0% for climate to 1% towards regenerative ag and other solutions could still save us, but we have to start now. So for regenerative ag to become the new normal, all we have to do is team up with farmers and ranchers to grow better food and restore the climate, and it can happen one penny at a time. Thanks.
Thank you. I know we've spent a lot of time introducing ourselves, but let's get into a discussion. And I do want to ask the panelists, just due to time, if we could keep our responses to about a minute, so we can all have time for the questions, a little discussion, and closing remarks. So the first question I want to go to John. John, you talked about the IPCC report, but I want to talk about the one that was recently released in its latest report on climate change and land use. The urgency of putting carbon back into the soil is greater now more than it has ever been. Can you tell us how AFT is addressing land use under pressure currently?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that report's on everyone's mind. I could take a lot of time getting into this, and you asked me not to, so I'll just hit a couple of highlights. Point number one is our focus, and the focus of many other organizations that we work with at this point, is really to scale things up. And we have the tools. This point, you've heard this from the panel, that we know what we need to do. The issue is we're not doing it at great enough scale. So on multiple levels, AFT through our regional offices, through some of our national work, we're trying to scale up. But the real point I want to make about that report is, although it was quite concerning in many ways, there was also a thread of real hope in that report. And it was that the latest science shows that we can actually reverse temperature increase over time if we ultimately get enough carbon back in the soil. So for those people who are now just focused on climate adaptation, say, no, folks, we can mitigate this thing. Don't forget the prize that is in sight. We can heal this planet through regenerative agriculture.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. Hunter, according to the estimates compiled by the FAO, by 2050, we will need to produce 60% more food to feed a world population of 9.3 billion people. Doing the farming as usual approach would take a really heavy toll on our natural resources. How can we feed the world with regenerative agriculture?
Industrial farming is failing. We have hundreds of hungry people, hundreds, thousands, millions of hungry people. Climate change is just going to make this worse. We have famine right now in the Horn of Africa, famine threatening millions, billions of people around the world. And at the same time, we are spending $1 million a minute subsidizing industrial agriculture, which is failing. So step one, let's take a little bit of that money and start putting it into regenerative agriculture, which, as in the case of Vijay Kumar, can triple production just through shifting from industrial to community managed natural farming. Let's start using the best of what we know to enable smallholder farmers who today produce 70 to 80% of the food around the world to do so a bit more productively. People say, oh, it's the industrial American farmer who's going to feed the world. No, it's not. It's the smallholder farmer learning how to implement more regenerative practices that will feed the world. Don't have to believe me. This is the conclusion of a report called Wake Up Before It's Too Late by the UN's Conference on Trade and Development, which said in terms, industrial agriculture cannot feed the world. It's going to be the smallholder farmers. And so we need to provide them around the world with how to do this. So a group that I work with called Now Partners is in the process of producing interviews with people like Vijay and Million and farmers in Brazil and Gabe Brown in the Dakotas, people from around the world who are doing this, succeeding in this. We call it the regenerative future of food. Wait for it.
We have the black. Thank you so much. And with that in mind, Merlin, our current agricultural model has a very hierarchical top-down structure. What does regenerative agriculture do to level the structures and really distribute power evenly?
Well, that's exactly what it does do. I mean, it's interesting. When I first started my Regen Iowa initiative about 7 years ago, there was a lot of resistance to the fact that Regen Ag was not profitable enough and it was too much work. But it's like we have crossed over that industrial chasm to the point to where we've got this renewed energy in regards to regenerative ag. I, for example, am sitting, and I chose to be out here to make my broadcast. I'm in Coon Rapids, Iowa, out in rural Iowa, just an absolutely beautiful spot out here. And I'm sitting in the center of the White Rock Conservancy. which is an indicator of how I think things are starting to change in Iowa and across the country. We, for example, put together, or the White Rock Conservancy is the owners of a soil health conservation easement, the first of its kind in the country, as far as we know, and certainly the first of its kind in the state. And what that easement allows, has allowed the White Rock Conservancy and the founders of the Garst Foundation, is to allow them to sell off acres of land, but that easement would allow the principles of soil health to be continued. The three primary principles are continuous living roots, mitigation of soil disturbance, and a mitigation of soil erosion. So it's that kind of initiatives that are starting to come to the forefront and take the lead in this whole regenerative ag movement that we're talking about. And we're happy to see that happen in Iowa, thanks to the Garst family and the White Rock Conservancy. But having said all that, that means that leveling the playing field here and empowering the farmers with new tools and technologies, helping them create more profitability with the regenerative types of things that we're discussing on this program, ultimately means that the farm to the table, and then the table to the farm, which Anthony is helping launch across the country, means that healthier food is going to be on the table for our families. And that means that we can address one of the biggest challenges we have here in Iowa, which is healthcare alone, primarily due to the fact of the way that we do agriculture. So I think the hierarchy is on notice, that it is changing, that we, the people, are stepping forward, wanting regenerative practices, not only to address climate change and to save our planet, but quite frankly, to save the human species. And we're all on this panel just the tip of the iceberg, but it's headed your way.
It is the tip of the iceberg. Thank you, Merlin. And Elizabeth, just talking about that, and we've heard a lot about carbon sequestration, but if you could just spend a minute talking about measuring soil carbon and the environmental benefits. A lot of times, we're getting a lot of responses is, what does that actually mean, and can we actually achieve it? If you could spend a little time talking about that.
Yes, the answer is yes, we can achieve it. The goal of Regen Iowa is to get 1 million acres converted to regen ag by 2025, and that's because the average regenerative farm has 200 plus microns of carbon per gram. And the back of my envelope says that, if we were to do 20 million acres, that would completely offset the carbon footprint of the United States. So this is a very achievable goal. And the question is, how fast can we get there? There's some really interesting technologies, and it's an evolving field of how you measure it. Earlier, Hunter and I were speaking about the ecological outcome verification system of the Savory Institute. There's the Haney method. There's a number of people working with satellites and with software. I personally am a big advocate of the microbiometer, which is a very low-cost test that farmers can do in the field with a smartphone app. And that product, Merlin's actually showing that, that product is a wonderful tool for farmers. You can look at the difference between land that has less than 100 microns, which is typical of carbon per gram, which is typical of most industrial farms, and you can look at plants that are grown literally inches away that are, and I'll post a picture of this on the We Don't Have Time website, and I'd love to use that platform to answer questions from your audience, but the plants are almost unrecognizable as the same species because of the fungal content and the other microbes that are in the soil. And unfortunately, from my perspective, investors are much more interested in spending money on technology to measure this than in actual solutions that can speed that process up, whether they call it biomimicry or other things. It all comes down to growing the biology and replacing those ecosystems in the soil.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And Anthony, we've heard a lot about the importance of regenerative agriculture. Can you explain how zero footprint can help scale the movement from advocates to a new normal?
Sure. I first really learned about that as a chef. And so we were running a restaurant, The Perennial, and we were really championing regenerative ag. This started back in 2015, before most people had even heard the term, I think. And, we're in San Francisco. It's kind of like farm to table everywhere. People almost have like farm to table fatigue. But so we'd be serving sourdough bread made from kernza, this perennial grain. Hey, this could change all of agriculture. Serving, beef from a carbon farming project where they were doing holistic grazing, like Hunter was referring to, plus compost application. And so I think on 1/10 of the ranch, after a few years, the project had already taken in as much carbon as not burning 1 million gallons of gas. So radically climate beneficial. The problem is in the US, there's 760 million acres of pasture and rangeland with cattle on it. A lot of it goes into the feedlot, et cetera. We don't approve of that, but it started to feel like there was no way for, that $1 from the consumer to make enough change. And beg the consumer, tell them this amazing story, hope that they spend that extra dollar, and then it might end up getting the farmer a few cents. Maybe the farmer's just using it to make ends meet, this and that. We know farming's tough. But really, there was like no way that that couple cents was ever going to incentivize the farmer's neighbor. And so that again is, I think it really like crystallized for me when some soil scientists told me like, hey dude, organic is 1% of acres after 50 years, right? And so, we stopped kind of bending over backwards, trying to beg the consumer for the dollar, and instead tried to focus on this structural change and this kind of collective action.
Thank you so much, Anthony. We have spent a lot of time talking about this today, but we could spend all day, all month, all year talking about regenerative agriculture. But in the last couple minutes that we do have together, I would like just to hear some closing remarks from our panelists. Just a little bit about what regenerative agriculture means to consumers and how consumers can play a role. Hunter, you did mention, it's the power of the dollar, right? It's what we buy. But if each of you can spend 30 to 45 seconds in the last few minutes that we have just for some closing thoughts, we would really appreciate it. John, we could start with you.
Sure. Well, I always resist simple solutions. But I do think in some ways we overcomplicate this. Really what we need to do is figure out mechanisms to compensate farmers for not only growing food, but for the full range of environmental services that they provide. And if we can get to that point, other things will take care of themselves because the best practices do pay for themselves. So how do we get there? And the answer is both a combination of government policy and market forces. We are terrible as a nation on understanding multivariables. Maybe the classic is diet and exercise, right? We can't figure out that you have to do both to get to the outcome. But I deal with policy all the time, and there's this group of people who think policy is the answer, and there's another group of people who say, no, government just screws everything up. The answer is always in the market. And the real answer is you need both. And when operating at the best, they're synergistic and they reinforce each other. So there are issues with measurement, like Elizabeth pointed out. Let those things that we know are good practices, but you can't quantify at a level that you can get a market to pay for it, let government support those items. And let the items that lend themselves to carbon trading or to the General Mills of this world getting value in the supply chain, let them work on that.
Yeah, I agree. We all have to work together. We're all part of the solution. So
exactly. So
we're all part of the solution.
I will stop there. Thank you all.
Thank you, John. Hunter, closing remarks.
Sure. Do one thing. Ask yourself every day, what's your dot? Do one thing. Here are two things that you can consider. We're told plant trees. If you've ever seen a tree blow over, look at the roots. The roots are tiny compared to the biomass of the tree. Trees burn in forest fires. They rot if they just lay there and release the carbon. Grass, the biomass is below ground. When things are grazing on it, the roots are sloughing polysaccharides, sugars, feeding the microbiological community that Elizabeth's been talking about. So don't plant a tree. Buy locally raised, grass-fed chicken, pork, beef, lamb. Connect with your local farmer. Do one thing. 2, where's your money? What are you invested in? A group of us put together a little exchange-traded fund. Change Finance, change-finance.com. We offset the carbon to the point that the companies that you're holding, to the extent you're holding them, are carbon negative through a group called Grassroots Carbon that's taking the money and spending it on regenerative grazing. Those are 2 things you can do today.
Thank you, Hunter. The power of our dollar. Merlin, closing thoughts from you.
Okay, my closing thought takes me back to when I graduated from high school in 1965, and 4% of Iowans had a chronic disease back then. What do you think it is today? I'll leave that question out there, but I'm going to answer it as well. It is now approaching 60% and surpassing that. So what are we doing different today, or what has caused this increase in chronic disease across our state and across our country? We've got to address that, because while we're talking about climate change and climate crisis and agricultural change and so forth, perhaps the biggest crisis we have in front of us in America and in the world is our health care. And so if we adopt regenerative agricultural practices, we can fix healthcare by providing food as medicine. Food is medicine, ladies and gentlemen. We have forgotten that, in part because when I was growing up on a farm back here, all food was organic. And so we've got to get back to that. And I'm very hopeful that as organizations like those of us that are on this panel come together and start collaborating and working together, which is what Hunter and I and John and Elizabeth and Anthony are all committed to, we can accelerate what we're doing, learn from each other. We don't have to reinvent the wheel in every state. When one state learns something, we can share it with the others. That's what Regen Iowa is about. It's really a national model and a global model, and we're looking to do it with all the people on this panel.
Thank you, Merlin.
Hope you all join us.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth, just quickly we don't have much time left. We have less than a minute, so 30 seconds.
Sure, no problem.
Closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts, I keep coming back to the soil biology, and you can, wherever you are in the world, find practitioners of Korean natural farming, soil food web, permaculture design. There are a number of indigenous traditions. They all are techniques for improving the ecosystem and the biodiversity of the soil. Find those practitioners in your community, for your garden, for your farm. Use them. That's the key.
Thank you. Anthony.
My one thing would be team up with farmers and ranchers to take the next step. So don't just buy from the good farmer, help the good farmer get better, help the conventional farmer start making the switch. And aside from buying, I think the big one is compost. I'm going to plug our program here, but basically just society needs to start viewing compost as equally as important as renewable energy, and just start making major policy shifts to compost and build up healthy soil that way.
Thank you so much. It sounds like we all have our marching orders, and I want to thank the panel for joining us today on Earth Day. We know that Earth Day is every day. It's not just April 22nd. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. We don't have time. And also, don't, like Elizabeth said, join the platform. She will be sharing a lot of pictures and information that will be very useful. And if you want to know more about the regenerative agriculture program at Earth Day, please visit earthday.org. Thank you so much, everyone, and happy Earth Day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
From regenerative agriculture in the food choices that we make and participate in every day to investing with intent, where and how we allocate our money and the implications of those decisions are not always obvious. Yet our investment choices really do matter. Let's learn more about this from true industry insiders. Niall O'Sullivan is the Chief Investment Officer of Asia, Middle East, and Africa for Investment Solutions at Mercer. He is responsible for the design, implementation, and ongoing supervision of Mercer Investment Management's fund solutions for all AMEA clients and discretionary management services. It's a pleasure to have you here, Niall. Over to you.
Wherever you are, and thanks a million for taking the time to join us today. We're going to talk about a number of topics over the next while, and what I'd like to try and do to start it is maybe just ground the concept and the idea of the size of the global assets under management. So, just to give an idea of the size and ubiquity of the global asset management space, there's over 100 trillion that is managed directly by asset managers. And that's just what they manage. It doesn't include the wealth that individuals have in their own portfolios. And so when you're seeking and thinking about generating returns, generating change, it is those assets and the capital they provide and the reinvestment that they control that is a key part of everything that will follow. So for many of you in the call, you'll feel, well, okay, what's that got to do with me? That doesn't overlap with my world. But actually, about 50 trillion of that 100 trillion is in various forms of pension and workplace savings solution. So if you have a 401k plan or some form of workplace savings, then your wealth figures somewhere in that number. And that plan will have a set of rules for how it engages, what it expects from the managers that manages assets, the types of assets that it will own, and the types of change that it will like to make. And your voice can make a difference. And you may say to yourself, oh, well, what can my voice do? But small holdings can have outsized influences. For example, engine number one only owned less than about 0.02% of Exxon, but yet they were still able to mount a campaign to get board members elected. So therefore, you have the ability to engage through your plan, through the rules, to see what you'll do on an ongoing basis. So that's the asset management landscape that we start with. Now let's think about what we know, or as the IPCC would call it, the elements that we have high confidence in. Humans are impacting and have impacted climate. Increasingly, this impact is leading to results that are going to result in temperature increases of 1.5 degrees or more, and keeping it to 1.5 degrees or less is becoming increasingly hard. Many governments and companies have committed to pathways to try and achieve this 1.5 degree or less. And that is going to result in actions. It's going to mean that we are going to do less of some things and more of other things. And investors have got to factor that into portfolio design. So now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about sustainability and impact. Because what I've just talked about leads to you having to consider the 4 R's. And those 4 R's are return, risk, regulation, and reputation. And it is the second 2 that are going to influence the first 2. Reputation is going to put a soft cost on externalities that have been ignored up until now. There will be threats on social license to operate for individual companies. Regulation is going to put a formal price on the externalities that were previously ignored, and that is going to lead to people losing their actual license to operate. And that regulatory side is critical. Without regulation, it is going to be impossible to achieve the goals that we talked about a few minutes ago. And sustainability is just the incorporation of those factors into your investment decision. Some people will say, isn't that just investing? And I would say it is. But when I started my career 25 years ago, I didn't see much talk about it in the textbooks or the risk variance models and all the things that are going on. So it may well be just investing, but you have to make sure that it is being incorporated on an ongoing basis. And then on top of that, impact is intentionally making investments to cause those outcomes to occur. Ideally, outcomes that would not have happened if you had not made that impact. And it's referred to as additionality. But you're doing it while still seeking an investment return. And everybody is going to have to figure out where on that journey they want to be between the incorporation of sustainability into their risk and the impact that they want to make. Now, one thing that I'd like to say, and I wish I didn't have to say it in the day that's in it, but this is going to be hard. The world is powered by fossil fuels and by processes that release CO2, be it plugging in, keeping cool, moving around, making food, or manufacturing. These are all processes that currently use fossil fuels or emit CO2 today. And when you consider that the world is adding a city the size of, or the equivalent of a city the size of New York to the world every 6 to 12 weeks, it brings into focus the amount of construction and manufacturing that will bring. We also have to consider that the developing world are aiming to have similar standards of living to those in the developed, and they will be looking to try and get to there. And so we have to think about the trade-offs between those. We can't just have a hard stop. We also have to recognize that by changing behaviors of companies, by changing the behaviors of some of the highest emitters, that will be the way to have the greatest outcome. Divestment, unless you ally it to the other things we talked about, regulation, taxation, consumer action, it just won't work. All it will do is increase or decrease the price that people will have to pay for those prospective income streams. So it's going to require actions across all those areas. So, what to do for you as an investor? Well, first of all, you've got to figure out what your beliefs are. Where do you want to be on that spectrum between sustainability and where do you want to focus your impact? So to maybe make it a little bit more real, let me give you an example. We were working with a large asset owner. First of all, using our right tool, they took a temperature check, excuse the pun, of where they were at a point in time. They used that to then set their key beliefs and principles. They first of all then looked at voting and engagement. How were the people that were managing their assets, be they actively managed or passively managed, engaging and voting with the companies that they owned? They made sure that key priorities were set and that they were communicated to those asset managers. And they monitored on an ongoing basis that the managers were voting, how they had voted, and what initiatives they were going to engage in. They then considered how their portfolio was going to transition. They set a science-based target for where they wanted to get to with key staging points that were going to be marked along the way. They looked at the assets that they owned. They looked at those that were green, embracing the change, the grey, that had a lot of change to be done, and the in-between, where things could be done on an ongoing basis. And they built a plan whereby they were going to own more of the green and influence the in-between and avoid the grey, but all subject to the levels of price in the marketplace, what they referred to as decarbonisation at the right price. On sustainability, they made sure that every manager that they worked with incorporated it into their risk and return lens, that it wasn't just a quantitative process. They wanted to make sure they were thinking about all these factors on an ongoing basis. And they made deliberate allocations to a number of thematic strategies that were going to create return opportunities from this transition. And on the impact, in the areas where they had the highest belief, they considered impact investing in those spaces and directed their capital there. And lastly, in order to make sure that their overall reputation was guarded, they codified all this into a sustainable investment policy. This was presented to their senior stakeholders and was available for communication as required externally. So before I hand over to Klaus to bring this on a little bit further, I'd probably like to just get you to kind of think about what are the key takeaways. I think the key takeaways for everybody on this call, be it you individually or for those of you that have stewardship of broader asset pools, you've got to figure out what it is your beliefs are, how do you want to incorporate sustainability into your investment, and where do you want to focus on an impact on an ongoing basis. Thank you.
Niall, thank you so much for those very clear action steps. We have heard you loud and clear. Much appreciated. Next, we have Dr. Klaus Kunz, Head of ESG External Engagement and Performance Reporting at Bayer. Klaus has been with Bayer since 2001, working on directing business strategic topics like research and development, project management, and sustainability. He's been leading Bayer's ESG strategy, and I know he has quite the story to share. Without further delay, let's hand the mic over to Klaus.
Hey, thank you, Swida, for the very nice words, and thanks for having me on behalf of Bayer today in this really super cool conference. And I'm really delighted that I have the chance to share with you a little bit on Bayer's journey, because actually we are a company working in health and nutrition, and I think it's a company with potential positive impact, which I want to share. I want to start on a positive note. You know, Bayer has about 100,000 employees, and I think we are a pretty good mirror of societal changes as well. We have it in our own company. And I want to share that the awareness that we don't have time has dramatically increased in the last couple of years, also inside of the company. So, I mean, we are very clear on all levels in the organization that we need to move and that we need to change things. The first time this became material was in like 4 years ago when our senior leadership decided to put sustainability at the core of our business and company strategy, which was a distinct move away from where we have been before. And I think it materialized very quickly, and the urgency became very clear that the first decisions were taken for Bayer, being a very large ship in a lightning fast time. We decided to become a carbon neutral company following the science-based targets 4 years ago. Our leadership in general said that non-financial targets are equally important to financial targets in the future, which I think is a massive change. And they also connected the success of achieving those targets to their own remuneration. And I know that this is what investors always want to know first. Is it connected to the remuneration of the top management? Yes, it is. But there was also a lot of commitments taken very soon related, for example, in the health area, that we want to satisfy the need of 100 million women in low and middle income countries for modern contraception in the next 10 years, that we want to help people and support people in underserved communities with better nutrition, 100 million also in the next 10 years. And you know, all these decisions are significant business decisions. This is not just doing projects which give some positive resonance in the media. This is redirecting the business towards more sustainability patterns and areas. But I'm sure you want to know more about agriculture, because that's the most controversial debate that crop science went through, Bayer Crop Science, in the last couple of years. And also here we made some decisions which I think are even more impactful than in the health area. And we first started to think, what of all the things that we currently already do are really material, and what are creating the biggest impact, and where do we need to change things? And I think in the last couple of weeks in Europe, particularly in Europe, the topic of food security has come back to our minds, that food security is not a given. That's in Germany, I can share. That's something which is a massive learning after almost 70 years of zero thinking about food security. Today, we are missing some basic products in the supermarket, and we face an upcoming food security crisis. So we made this commitment already 3 years ago that we need to help to provide enough safe and affordable food, but we need to make sure that it's also there where it's most needed, namely in the countries, low and middle income countries, once again, in Asia and in Africa, where I think we were not present enough. So another business decision taken to redirect investments, capital, and resources to support 100 million smallholder farmers in those countries in the next 10 years through partnerships, access to capital, access to products, access to markets, access to trainings, and all these type of things. I think it's a massive plan. It's a business plan which is already fully underway. On the other hand, we realized that, you know, the other two topics which our industry usually didn't talk so much about is the impact on the environment of our products of agriculture. And we need to be very clear and outspoken that, of course, agriculture impacts the environment, impacts biodiversity, and also impacts climate. So to produce more on the one hand is one thing, to impact less on the other thing is the other thing. And it's a bit of a paradox, but we have no other way. We need to improve on both ends. And to work on the environmental side, we committed, for example, to reduce the environmental impact of, we call it crop protection, you might call it pesticides, but the impact of those pesticides, our pesticides, in the next 10 years also by 30%, which is significant. And we think that technology can help, precision application, for example, so that in the future, those products are only applied when needed and in the amount needed and where needed. But please, that's a really dramatic mindset shift from a business model which was driven through inputs before into much more of an output-driven business model, where, you know, the lesser inputs we have, the better the outcome is. So it's a change, massive change. The other topic, and this is the one I want to close with, is climate. We made a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on the fields of our customers also by 30% in the next 10 years. And here's something happened which I'm particularly proud of, and it shows that we are really serious about it and try to go fast, and really fast, is that we saw an opportunity, because if we cannot come up with business models that are attractive for farmers, it's not going to scale. And the opportunity is that companies like Bayer, many other companies at this point of time, need to offset parts of their emissions because they cannot go down to zero. So somebody else has to close the cycle for us and bring the carbon back into the soil which we are emitting. And we were wondering if farmers couldn't play a positive role here. If farmers couldn't be part of the solution in the future. And they can, because they grow crops. So we have basically started this, we call it the Bayer Carbon Initiative. We are following very, very standardized, certified procedures. Farmers who follow those procedures, they might get into the opportunity of creating value by doing climate smart agriculture. And this is what we are looking for, business opportunities for doing things better and more sustainable. And this is how we can connect a commitment to reduce our emissions, for example, to an impactful commitment and an impactful opportunity for growers to create value. Because it's the triangle, people, planet, but also profit, which must be respected. And if the profit doesn't work for farmers, they can't adopt. I want to close with that. That's the series of things which we have implemented. For me, it's important is that we implement it, not only committed, but that we're on a trajectory to do these type of things. And I really ask you, if you want, take a look in our sustainability report and track us down on our progress and give us feedback. And tell us if you think that's right or wrong. Tell us if it's enough or if it's not enough, if it's ambitious enough or not, if the measures and the methodologies are the right ones. Because if we cannot find the acceptance on a broader societal level, it's not going to fly, and it's not going to fit into an ESG strategy in the future. So that's my ask for you. Help us to do it right. We are committed to do it right, but we need your help. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaus, for those words. And you are definitely interacting with the right organization. The whole point and purpose of We Don't Have Time and our app is to be able to connect companies to users so that they can actually respond and give feedback. So thank you for that call to action, because you will surely be hearing from our global user community. And we love facilitating that kind of engagement, because exactly, we need to bring everyone into the fold to be part of the solution, to help give feedback so the companies really do hold themselves to the highest standard and do better if they need to. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and we appreciate you sharing your story with us. Please stay on as we move into our panel, and we're going to loop in 3 additional speakers as well. So we have Max Maservi, who is Senior Sustainable Investment Consultant in Mercer US's Sustainable Investments team. Max provides advice on sustainable investment strategies, climate change, and impact investment approaches throughout investment processes. We also have with us Inga West, who is Senior Sustainable Investment Specialist in Mercer's European Investment Solutions business. She's based in London and is responsible for advising and driving the implementation of sustainable investment practices across the Mercer Investment Solutions offerings, with a focus on integrating ESG factors, sustainability trends, climate change, and stewardship within the investment process. We're also thrilled to have with us McKnight Foundation's Director of Investments, Elizabeth McGovern, who oversees the team that manages the foundation's $3 billion endowment. With her leadership and vision, the foundation committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions across its entire portfolio by 2050, the largest private US foundation to do so. So we really have a powerhouse team here to understand how asset owners play a key role in helping clients prepare for their future, and generally how to think about client futures and ensure that sustainability is really where investment is headed. So thank you all for being here. I'm excited about this discussion we're about to have. And I'll start with you, Elizabeth. This is fascinating what you've done under your leadership at McKnight and the lofty goals that you've set. Why is this so important to you? Why is leading on this commitment so critical to McKnight more broadly?
It's critical to McKnight because we are a climate change grant maker. So we recently kind of hearkening back to the urgency that Klaus talked about, we doubled our grant making to the climate change space several years ago. So we now provide $30 million to the nonprofit organizations, the policy actors, the advocates, the disruptors to do the work in the Midwest of the US. And if the Midwest region of the US was a country of its own, our region would be the 6th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. That's how much industrial and coal burning energy production happens in this region of the US. So once we made that commitment, it included the words that we needed, that it was urgent and we needed to be bold. And frankly, we only give away 5% of our endowment every year, and the remaining 95% of the endowment remains invested in capital markets. So it became really clear that we were being beat on climate before we even arrived at the office in the morning. And that meant we needed to be bolder and more urgent with our endowment and try to find ways to invest differently so that we could contribute to, both benefit from all of the wonderful innovation that's coming from the transition to a clean economy, but also make sure that we were reducing our risks to the older economy and kind of old ways of doing things. So we see it as an opportunity to make money. We see it as an opportunity to reduce risk. And we see it as a way to be kind of coherently aligned between the work that my colleagues are doing in the world and the work the investment team is doing in the markets.
This really is a win-win-win, and you're making that very clear. So to those who are tuning in that are thinking about investments of themselves as individuals, of the broader organizations that they engage with or affiliate with, this is how to think about it. Setting these lofty standards is what we should all be aspiring to achieve. So thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth. Let's go to Max. Max, we're talking really about how to help guide clients to set their priorities and really help prepare them for a future that is aligned to this broader sustainability mission. How do you think about this? How does Mercer help clients do this?
Sure, and thanks, Sweta. So our sustainable investment practice at Mercer started back in 2004 on a formal basis. And so we've been working on these issues for nearly 20 years now. We have 25 dedicated specialists around the world, and we've been advising clients on socially responsible and sustainable investment topics for decades, even prior to the founding of our team. So across investor movements on hot button topics such as divesting from businesses operating in apartheid era South Africa in the 1980s, or tobacco manufacturers in the 1990s, to, of course, climate change today. We've been helping our clients to address key emerging risks and opportunities in their portfolios for many years. So over the course of hundreds, if not thousands, of engagements with clients around the world, our SI team, or Sustainable Investments team, has developed a 4-step process that we call the SI Pathway to help our clients clarify their perspectives and develop strategic approaches to considering key issues within their investment portfolios. So these 4 steps are beliefs, policy, process, and portfolio. There's tons of details we could discuss about each of those steps, but I think it's really worth focusing here on just the first 2, the beliefs and the policy. And so when we're talking to our investors, we start our engagements by first, providing educational sessions to our clients around, what does sustainable investing mean? What's the terminology that we're talking about? What are all the various acronyms that you want to be aware of and concepts? And they're able to then ask us, any clarifying questions that they might have. We then survey each of these individuals on this investment committee or board of trustees to understand their perspectives that they come to the table with. Do they believe in these topics? What's their level of understanding of the various concepts at play? And then bring those survey results back and kind of have a workshop session to discuss the results amongst the group, and then find areas of convergence or consensus and areas of divergence potentially. From there, we want to kind of create these belief statements. And these statements are really, an interesting sort of statement about what does this institution believe the future holds? And what do they believe that their role is in the world as an institution? It's a moment of almost self-reflection, if you will. And, it may be surprising to some in the audience that, major investors might start their sustainability journeys by thinking about what do they believe in about the world. But what we're really ultimately asking them is, what does the future look like? And what's the role that they play in helping to both, shape that future through potentially, say, impact investing, as Mal was referencing earlier, or potentially just to mitigate some of those risks that they might see out on the horizon, whether it's climate change or other ones. So for everyone listening in today, if you have investments of your own, whether through your retirement plan, you have a brokerage account or otherwise, you too can start to ask yourself, what sort of investor you'd like to be, and what are your beliefs about the world? Thinking through your own beliefs and then finding ways to incorporate them into your investments is really at the heart of what being an intentional investor is all about.
That's fantastic, Max. That really relates what it might be a black box for many people back to their daily lives. We're all wearing a variety of different hats, and the number one hat that we all share and have in common is we are humans and we have a belief system, and we need to help some align that belief system better to the reality of the risks that we are collectively facing related to the changes in our environment. So thank you for sharing that and giving our audience really tangible steps to take to think through their role in all of this. So I would love to turn now to Inga. We just heard from Max and Elizabeth how priorities are aligned to sustainability goals and how we see the future for ourselves, for the different organizations we affiliate with, and as employees of an organization like Mercer, how to help your clients better align their priorities to future sustainability goals. So how do you think about these priorities as part of a bigger picture, both company-wide and industry-wide?
Sure, thank you. So as an investment manager with approximately $440 billion in assets under management globally, we at Mercer Investment Solutions believe we have an important role to play in the transition and mobilizing capital towards more sustainable investments. Now, Mercer Investment Solutions uses an outsourced CIO approach. So we support institutional investors in an effort to meet their goals more efficiently by providing them with guidance on setting investment strategy, manager research and allocation, and the day-to-day operations of the investment program. Now, importantly, as a fund of funds manager, we have exposure to over 150 managers. And this affords us the opportunity to not only drive change within the investment solutions we manage, but also positively influence the investment managers we work with to invest with intent. This is so there's not only an impact through the portfolios they manage on our behalf, but rather on the market as a whole. Now, climate change is a systemic and financial risk, and it's one of our key investment beliefs, and therefore climate considerations are embedded throughout our investment process. We have also set a net zero commitment with interim targets across a number of our investment solutions in order to support the transition. Now, setting a net zero commitment is just the first step in the journey, and it requires a well-articulated plan if we are to achieve it. And there are 4 key levers that we use as part of our approach. So firstly, focusing on ESG integration. We look to allocate to managers that have embedded consideration of environmental, social, and governance factors into the investment process. Our dedicated manager research team has assigned over 4,500 ESG ratings to investment strategies, and we use these to inform our manager selection decisions. Secondly, as part of ESG integration, there's a specific focus on climate. We use tools such as climate scenario modeling to inform our asset class allocations, given different asset class sensitivities to climate change. We also use tools such as our proprietary Analytics for Climate Transition, aptly named as ACT, which uses a variety of climate-related metrics to assess climate-related risks and opportunities. They say what gets measured gets managed, and these tools provide us with the opportunity to monitor and manage our exposure to grey assets, so assets with high carbon intensity and low transition capacity, and green assets, so assets with low carbon intensity and high transition capacity. And thirdly, as much as the climate crisis poses significant risks, we know that there are numerous investment opportunities on the transition journey, and we seek to include allocations to sustainability-themed investments and investments that will drive the transition. And finally, as Niall alluded to earlier as well, we use our rights and responsibilities as active owners to influence the managers we invest in, to invest with intent, and to work with the underlying companies they invest in to implement more sustainable business practices. And, just to bring it to light slightly, this is done, for example, by encouraging these managers to develop and implement formal climate policies, support industry initiatives such as the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and the more recent Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We encourage them to enhance their climate-related disclosures, set decarbonization targets, and actively engage with underlying companies and be active in their voting activities. And we work with them to enhance the consideration of climate factors across their investment process.
Thank you, Inga. So from Mercer's ESG journey, I'm curious to get a different perspective on efforts in communication and ESG. So I'll come back to you, Klaus. It's no secret that Bayer has had its challenges and in terms of public perceptions, and has really made an effort to build back trust with consumers and various stakeholders. So how has ESG supported this effort at rebuilding trust?
I think two parts of the answer. The first thing, what I found very challenging in the beginning when designing a sustainability strategy, was to understand that in different geographies in the world, the understanding of what sustainability actually means is very different. So in Europe, we have a very strong environmental focus on the topic. In the Americas, is a much stronger economic perspective on the same topic. And then in Asia, you would have much more the social dimension of sustainability. And, we need to come up with a triangle which is encompassing all those dimensions to get the acceptance around the world for what we do, but also to do the right things which are needed in the respective geographies. So it's really addressing the environmental pieces and the profitability pieces and the social dimensions at the same time, while we understand that not everything resonates equally strongly in every geography. That was important when it came to then translating a sustainability strategy into ESG, into an investable framework. I realized that the biggest doubts on us is on trust and transparency. So this is, I think, the area. It's not actually like change all your products, change all your offers that you have, because it's, I think, widely accepted that, we make a significant and even systemic contribution, for example, to food supply. But the way we are doing it and the way we talk about it, this is challenged by many investors and by many stakeholders. And I think it's an opportunity for us. But this is what we need to learn. We need to learn to acknowledge that we need to change, and also that we made mistakes in the past. And I think we are on a good track. And it's even rewarding if you speak in an audience with lots of critical voices, that you really connect. But we need to start our communication at the concerns of the audience and not at our perspectives for the future. And I think then we can make a successful connection. That's my learnings from the last couple of months.
Yes, fantastic. Well, thank you for your candid response to that question. I'm sure it comes up, and that's why it's so important to have these cross-sector conversations as well, and to join forces with different types of organizations like foundations. And so back to you, Elizabeth, and the role that foundations can really play in aligning to the broader mission across sector of philanthropy, but also generally, how do you think about the bigger mission for grant makers, and how do net zero goals really align to that larger grant making mission?
Well, I think the basis of philanthropy is belief in a better, different future. And sometimes it means that we know there are so many important social actors that need funding to do that work. But there is a piece of kind of more traditional approach to endowments and foundations to those assets that we're built upon. There's a notion that there's a wall between us and the mission of the organization, and McKnight is really seeking kind of to integrate our views on the future and climate with our investment endowment. And I think one of the challenges in markets is sometimes there's an assumption that markets are kind of without morality. They're just reacting to what is. And I think that's a huge mistake, that asset owners really have a enormously important role in shaping future markets. And in order to shape markets, you have to send signals. And so one of the reasons McKnight made a net zero commitment was kind of hoping to invite some of our fellow foundations in the US into this conversation about how do we use our endowments to signal these important marketplaces. And it's been mentioned by colleagues in this session already, but the power of the customer, even an individual customer, or in this case, we're a $3 billion owner, our fund managers can manage up to $1 trillion. So it's important for them to hear from us. So we're asking for greenhouse gas emissions data on each of the funds in which we're invested. We're asking for how many of the investments in the portfolio are actually providing climate solutions. That kind of inquiry to your service providers is actually very motivating to them, because they know if this small foundation in the upper Midwest is asking me today, I can bet that these other much bigger, more important clients of mine are going to ask maybe next year or the year after. So I do think that that there's kind of a drive to integrate internally within our own walls, and then there's a desire to signal externally so that other financial actors can start getting the pieces in place. As you hear from Mercer, that they've already done that. They've heard from clients and continue to develop services because they've been signaled by their customers. So I think each of us has a role to play, whether we're one investor in a personal savings or a large institutional investor.
Absolutely. And you're paying attention to these signals, you're responding to the signals, and that's very clear here. Just this conversation is making it evident that you're paying attention and responding and reacting to the needs and wants of your clients and consumers. So one of the things that is being expressed globally is a desire to see increased partnership and collaboration. And it sounds like that's happening within philanthropy from what you've just explained to us, Elizabeth. I'm curious as to how this is happening in the asset owner sectors. So Max, to you, how do you think about collaboration industry-wide? How do you think about data sharing? Is this something that could be pursued maybe better, or how is it going from your vantage point?
Sure, it's a great question. So, there's many ways to think about how data sharing will work. And I think that it's important to step back and trace out a number of different regulatory and non-regulatory initiatives that are underway currently that I fully believe are going to radically reshape the amount of climate and sustainability data that investors and, by the way, the general public are going to have access to in the very near future. So I believe Inga is going to probably touch on some of the trends happening in Europe that are already well underway in her segment. I want to at least highlight a few examples, both internationally and here in the United States. And I have to apologize in advance for the gratuitous use of a few acronyms here. We love our acronyms in sustainable finance. But the first one I would highlight is the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, which was an initiative that set out it was launched in Glasgow, the COP 2026 in Glasgow last November. And it's really this massive international consortium of different organizations that themselves have put forth kind of disclosures standards for different corporate, disclosures and also investor disclosures. They've come together to form this kind of climate and sustainability framework that's intended to be adopted by financial regulators around the world. So they have an open comment period right now. They're seeking feedback from the public about the kind of initial kind of drafts that they put together. But really what they're seeking to do is create an international framework for how we can capture, gather, and then disclose sustainability data from across, again, corporate and investor spheres in a way that's really, kind of unified and harmonized for the benefit of hopefully, really all of us. So the ISSB is one that's a really major undertaking. Here in the United States, we have had more significant action from some of our regulators across various different spheres, one of which the Securities and Exchange Commission, our financial regulator, just recently released climate disclosure rules for companies and also some private market companies as well. And so this is going to really require, that every company, virtually every company is going to be required to report, scope 1, scope 2 emissions, potentially scope 3, and I'm sure we can talk about what those scopes are. But really, it's going to radically reshape how much information we have about where greenhouse gases are tracking across the entire economy. And just because of the size of the U.S. marketplace, I mean, this is going to really affect a lot of different entities, even those who have multinational operations. I would also mention that Inga and others have touched on the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. These recommendations were released in 2017, and they were initially, they've been voluntary in many ways. And it's kind of a cross-sectoral framework for disclosure of how companies and investors are considering and strategically reacting to climate-related risks and opportunities to their business models. But what's particularly notable about TCFD is that it included this element of forward-looking, what's called scenario analysis, which is essentially projecting out into future climate scenarios of warming over pre-industrial times. So you might think of 1.5 degrees Celsius as kind of the goal that we're all aiming towards these days. But what if we overshoot that target? What does a 2 degrees Celsius world look like? And how would that impact your business? What would a 3 degrees Celsius scenario look like? And how might that affect your business model as well? So it asks companies and investors to really look out ahead and strategically plan for what eventualities could occur. The reason I bring up TCFD is because just recently we've had a development here in the United States also where our National Association of Insurance Commissioners, who regulate insurance companies here, are now requiring that virtually every most, I think 80+% of insurance companies are going to be required to report against TCFD standards. Now, insurance companies, as many of you know, they're kind of the risk managers of society. And the fact that they're now going to be looking ahead, incorporating more forward-looking scenario analysis into their assessments of risk is really going to be quite significant. So all of this to say, all these interlocking elements are pointing towards a direction that we're going to be seeing a flood of new climate and sustainability data in the near future. I think it's going to be the job of many different global actors from across the business, governmental, and indeed the non-governmental sectors to kind of take in all this information and really assess whether our economy is decarbonizing at the pace we need to reach that 1.5 degree goal.
This is fascinating, Max. Thank you so much for sharing this information. This really might, our viewers, some of them might be hearing this for the first time. So we appreciate the acronyms and the spelling out of the acronyms and the detail you're providing. It's very relevant. And you teed up a question for Inga, and so I'd love for her to respond to that, and to also to continue to make this relevant for our viewers. What is it that the single investor who's hoping to make an impact with their financial decisions and allocations, what is that you tell them? What should they be thinking about? So 2 in 1 for you there, Inga.
Yeah, sure. Very interesting what Max spoke to about TCFD initially starting out as a voluntary framework back in 2017. And similarly, in the UK, we've more recently seen that it has now also become mandatory for certain schemes over a certain size. The initial one is 5 billion to report in line with TCFD recommendations. And the view is that going forward, this will be rolled out to smaller schemes, possibly to the point where we are actually seeing all schemes having to report in line with TCFD. And I think also, what some of the viewers may be familiar with is that we have seen a lot of regulation come out in the EU specifically, as well as part of the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan, really established to help mobilize capital to more sustainable investments. And as part of that, some of the issues are around what is a sustainable investment. So again, the regulation coming out with clear guidelines as to what constitutes a sustainable investment, a lot of disclosure, looking at the sustainable finance disclosure regulations, the EU taxonomy. So really trying to find ways to standardize how we look at things so that we can ensure that assets are going to more sustainable investments. And I think just onto the second point, I think Elizabeth kindly covered quite a bit of that actually. And I guess the point is that irrespective of how big or small you are as an asset owner, your voice counts. And it is, largely because we have clients that are asking questions, also, triggering us to think of things differently. So we really do value the input that we receive from clients. And I think very importantly, as a client looking for, where do I want to invest, really to try and understand your manager's approach to thinking about sustainability. Is it really embedded in their DNA? Are they purely setting out policies, or are they able to actually evidence the impact and the outcomes that they are having? And are they able to show that effective stewardship that they are having with the companies that they are investing in by engaging? And what is the outcomes of those engagements been? And are they linking their voting activities, to these engagements as well? So, just as my closing point, I would say, as investors, we have a very important role to play in mobilizing capital to more sustainable investments. And while we have seen a significant amount of assets already start to move into sustainable investments, much more is needed in order to move the dial. And they say that with great power comes great responsibility. And I really think that we as investors need to be thinking and embracing the growing opportunities that we have to invest with intent.
Inga, so perfectly put. I wish I could have handed it off to you and hit a gong, because that was an excellent closing. But before we close, I would love to just bring Klaus in for the final word and to really talk a little bit about how you think about how you measure success. How does Bayer measure success? And how does your company's story, how is it an example for others in your sector? And just, I know we only have a minute left, and I wish I had more time to pick your brain. I had a previous life in pharma and biotech, so I have many more questions for you that I hope we can pick up in the future. But for now, talk to us a little bit about how you measure success.
Yeah, let's not do a benchmarking. I just want to talk about how we measure success. For me, it's three things. The first is we keep going, running with high speed, embedding this in business. And just as a very recent example is in the crop science division, the sustainability department was fused with the business strategy department. I think that's a strong signal that this is changing and is now in a different place where it has much more drive and also impact. The second thing is that we execute against what we committed. For me, super important. And I just want to say that we also want to go more and more to really measure impact, less and less into input commitments, much more into outcome commitments. And that's complicated, but a commitment to measure environmental impact reduction, I think, is one of the first true impact commitments which are out there in our industry. And last but not least, I have to use this opportunity. Forgive me, but if you want to help me and inside of the company to drive changes, make investments into Bayer which are assigned to ESG-related changes, and make it clear. This would help me tremendously to make it super clear that this matters from a financial perspective. And that's basically my ask to you. If you have any questions how this could work, if you have any proposals, what you want us to do differently, please contact me. But then, linking this to concrete investment decisions that would help us in the industry a lot to make it super clear that that's the way to go.
Thank you, Klaus. And that's a fair ask to all viewers. become asset owners yourself and get involved in the decision making, and let's together really become the solution to the climate crisis. Thank you all for all that you do and everything you've shared, and for really moving money towards a sustainable future. Sustainable finance is such a critical component of what we're trying to accomplish here, and you are all very much engaged in this space in a way that gives me hope and a lot of positivity towards where the future of this sector is headed. So thank you very much for your time and for your input. I'm thrilled to close out our segment on investing with intent with Kara Williams. She is a senior partner and is the ESG strategy leader for Mercer. She also oversees Mercer's private wealth businesses in Canada and India, and works with Mercer's multinational clients to deliver the best of Mercer's broad wealth solutions. So it's not just positive financial outcomes for organizations and their employees, but sustainable ones that are ultimately win for wealth as well as for the planet. I can tell, Kara, that you are the woman to pick first if we're going to be in an intramural match. So you are the person I want on my team. Thank you so much for having this fireside chat with me.
Apologies. Thanks for having us on.
No worries at all. This is how we know we're still in the world of Zoom. So tell our audience a little bit how you think about supporting positive financial outcomes for your clients that are truly positive outcomes for the environment as well. The real question here is, can these actually coexist?
Absolutely, they can coexist. I mean, I think the not only the panelists, but also the speakers that we had at the beginning have highlighted the fact that there is no question that there's a direct interlink between doing right for the planet is actually good investment acumen. It's a factor that needs to be taken into consideration when you're looking to make your investments. So not only is it doing right, but it actually is a way for you to profit. And I think Elizabeth McGovern even mentioned that herself, right? That these are not two disconnected concepts.
We've heard from your colleagues quite a bit about what you just said and how they think about the future of ESG, what Mercer is doing, what Bayer is doing, and what it means both internally within the sector, but also within the company, but also sector-wide. So what is the driving principle for private sector to mobilize against the climate crisis? Is it really ESG? Can this be what brings companies together internally and sector-wide?
Yeah, Hugh, there's been a bit of mention of a number of acronyms, and I think the fact that there's regulation that is coming in around the globe that initially starts off as voluntary pledges that various firms are making, and that the regulation now is becoming kind of more normalized as a really important step. So there is no question that you see just about every corporate now talking about sustainability in some shape, whether or not they've gone to the lengths that maybe Bayer has to incorporate these things into the way that they're trying to shift and change their business towards their own sustainable future, may not be necessarily quite as advanced. But there is no question that ESG, so that environmental, social, and governance factors are absolutely starting to take a big part at the corporate table, right? So you see most leadership teams that this is a core part of their discussions about, again, how are they going to shift their businesses for a changing world, and in order to make sure that it is a good place for people and for planet.
So how much of this is really being driven by internal desire to, well, Mercer, for example, is a company that's really leading in this. How much of this is really coming internally? And I don't mean necessarily to speak for other companies, but from somebody who is in this industry, what are you seeing? What are kind of the trends that we're seeing versus how much of this is actually coming from outside regulators that are demanding that, and hopefully becoming more persistent and finding some way to hold companies accountable for those that are delinquent, but how much of it is truly coming from within versus being mandated from outside?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's important to be cynical, right? When you're looking to mobilize your own savings towards investments. It's really important to have a good sense of whether or not you think a firm is authentic and what they're trying to achieve. And remember, it is ESG, right? So firms, not everybody has decided that necessarily certain aspects of climate are what they want to prioritize. Other firms have made it very clear that they really want, that it's the social agenda that they want to address, or it could potentially be certain governance aspects that they want to really work on. And it could be, a lot of times it's linked to what industries that they function in. There's no question that it's not necessarily true to the DNA of absolutely every firm that's out there. But what we are seeing is a lot of firms are starting to identify with the fact that having a purpose and having a value system in place is critical, not only for them and how they drive their business and where they go in their own futures, but also in engaging their employee base as well as shareholders, right? So there is always the link to profit. And, I'm not going to separate that, right? This isn't necessarily true altruism, but there's no question that a lot of firms have decided that there are certain aspects of ESG that are really important to them, have chosen those, made those very clear. And I think it was Inga before who referred to measurement, have said, here are very clear set targets that we want to be held to account for. They say those out loud, they say it in front of the people, they say it in front of shareholders. And I think that is a huge and critical step. Absolutely, there are still firms that maybe, we hear the term greenwashing a lot. There's surely firms that haven't quite figured it out yet. And certainly maybe firms who have the right intention, but haven't quite figured out how to implement. ESG is massive, right? So if you look at environmental aspects and where do you set your priorities, or you look at the social aspects, where do you set your priorities there? It's an incredibly complex area, but as soon as a company can kind of drive down to the things that really are important to them, and again, will hold themselves to account for those things, you start to see some really amazing authenticity emerging from companies that start to have personalities rather than a brand. And I think it is an absolute growing trend. I think those of us who work for Mercer, there's certain priorities that have been very important to us for a very long time that our leadership has been very clear on, and they've been consistent, and we can believe it, right? So I think that's, we happen to be lucky, but there are a lot of other firms out there that do hold themselves to the same type of accountability as Mercer.
I like that a lot. Companies have personalities, and we can definitely see that. The public is engaging ever more with companies via social media platforms, via the app that we are on right now, the We Don't Have Time app. And so individuals can get this information, and it can really guide their decision-making behavior. So thank you for sharing this information, which might not be evident or easily accessible all the time. But we want to get the public on board, and we want to be able to share with the public the power that they have in terms of which companies to align with, which personalities match their own, right? So what does this mean for the individual? Why do their decisions matter? How do you think about that?
Their decisions matter. Let's go back to cynicism. Their decisions matter because they hold the dollars, right? So every single dollar matters to every single corporate if they want to last longer term. So I think that where we've seen the biggest shift is in the past. It used to be always about the biggest investors, right? The ones with the biggest asset pools that were driving decisions that were happening in corporations. What we're finding now is 13, 14-year-old girl in Sweden can actually have genuine, true impact in shifting the way that governments are setting standards and policies. I think now people realize that an individual actually can be a lot more important in a decision and the shift that a company is going to make. There is no underestimating the power of the individual anymore. And social media certainly has made that much easier, right? So, I'm not sure we would all know who Greta was if it wasn't for the power of social media. So thanks to these types of platforms, hopefully people feel more engaged, feel more empowered. Because they absolutely are, and corporates absolutely listen to the individual, not only as the people who are potentially going to be investing into them, but also as future customers, as well as future employees. And I think there's a huge value chain along the value of every individual that wasn't recognized in the past.
And of course, individuals wear multiple hats. Individuals are part of communities, individuals are affiliated with various organizations, individuals are employees. And so what has Mercer learned along its sustainability journey that would be helpful and relevant for individuals that are somewhere along this journey themselves in a variety of different associations? So as the consumer, as the employee. Mercer is a multinational, and it's far along on the spectrum of where other companies are or hope to be as it relates to ESG. So some advice to those other multinationals or those that are somewhere between startup phase and establishing themselves as real contenders in sustainability activity. What are some of the takeaways that you could provide to them in terms of some of the challenges that Mercer has faced and has overcome?
I'd start with what Klaus referred to earlier. I think it's really important to be extremely honest with where you have had any kind of shortfalls, where you may not be achieving the targets that you wanted to achieve, missteps. I think that again, this goes back to that level of authenticity of firms really being able to say, mea culpa, I did not do this right, and now I'm going to fix it, and being very open and honest about it. And that's, again, a big shift. You didn't see firms do this in the past. It was all about sort of the PR shift to try to cover, cover anything that they may have thought of as being negative. So I think the first step, and it's not an easy step, again, is establishing your own values. What do you want to stand for as a firm? Again, if we refer to the personalities, who do you want to be known as, regardless if you're, a FTSE 100 firm? Who are you, and what do you want to be held to account for? What do you want your people to be proud of? And then again, measure it and tell people where you are on your journey. Shift it, reassess it, reassign if it's not where you need to be, become more aggressive in those targets if need be, and if you fall short, again, just honestly address that fact.
Fantastic, Karen. In our last minute on this very auspicious date of April 22nd, Earth Day, what is the message you would like to share with our millions that are tuning in, that are listening, and that are hoping to learn something today and to take something away from this special day that is Earth Day? What would you like to leave our audience with?
I think the one word that would have been said and repeated most often amongst my fellow speakers today was engagement. And I think it is critical, especially as today is Earth Day. The more that you realize that you actually are responsible and you can engage with the people who are managing your money, the corporations where you're putting your money, the products that you're purchasing, the way that you deal with your own individual carbon footprint. We as people and each individual have so much more power than we ever had thought that we had. And I think that's been the most powerful shift that we've seen. And the beauty is that hopefully it's enough to recognize that in order to address climate change and hit the net zero targets that we've got, that each individual person starts to recognize the fact that we aren't powerless. This isn't about us sitting back and just having governments make all the changes. It's corporates, it's governments, it's individuals, all of us together as communities coming together to address what we've done.
I love that. Thank you so much. You really resonated with what we like to say at We Don't Have Time, is that together we are the solution to the climate crisis. Thank you so much, Kara, for humanizing finance. Really appreciate your thoughts and for taking the time to share them with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. It was really nice to meet you and hear and learn from you. So thank you very much.
Cool. Finally get to chat. Better than the pungent smells in Pennsylvania.
Yep, we're already in the room.
if I'm already laughing, it's because I have in studio with me Andy Karstner, my friend. Thank you so much for joining us here today on Earth Day. Appreciate you being here.
So happy to be with you, especially today.
Right? So I'm looking at my notes so I don't miss anything. Andy, and this list is not exhaustive, is a leading corporate innovation strategist, a clean energy entrepreneur, policymaker, regulator, diplomat, space cowboy, that's a thing. And my favorite title is friend, because despite your incredible resume, I would say reputationally, you're best known for being a connector and really an amplifier of good ideas and good people. So even though you are executive leadership currently at X, and that was formerly Google X, and you were George W. Bush's Assistant Secretary of Energy, and you're currently on the board of ExxonMobil as an internal climate activist, you are genuinely best known for loving what you do and really connecting with people and the work, and it really shows.
So you just won the role of writing my epitaph. So you count on having my will revised. So
I am happy to, more than happy to.
It's very generous.
It's very easy.
Yeah.
For you, it's very easy.
I think that's the intro my father would be proud of and my mother would believe.
I love it. So we want to get into some juicy details of what you've been up to.
Sure.
And the audience can Google juicy details. But we'll start with the juiciest here, and then feel free to follow up on your own. You are on the board of one of the biggest polluters of all time, ExxonMobil. Please explain to us how this happened, and is there hope for turning this oil and gas giant around?
Well, so how it happened is by a vote of the shareholders at last year's annual general meeting. It's almost going to be a year now. It was fairly historic and fairly surprising, not least to me.
Right.
We had to do a lot right to make it happen, and that entailed simply having a useful strategy for shareholders to put their arms around on capital allocation, how a company spends its money, what its future would be in terms of midterm and long-term planning, a energy transition that they could viably believe in, and what kind of action they were taking to deal with climate change risk, amongst other things. So can things turn around? Yes, I think that the company is, all companies have to be deeply sensitive to who their owners are,
right.
And their owners get to vote. So I believe democratic stakeholder capitalism works. A lot of people would say, well, I'd rather abdicate, I'd rather divest, I don't want to give my money to these things. You don't get your money into it, you don't get a vote, you don't get to influence it. So the idea that we can influence things, and as your last speaker said, make the ESG movement more mature, more impactful, more influential to outcomes, I think those are good things and good trends.
No, definitely. Do you get pushback? Do people understand what it is that you're trying to do here internally? Because there's so much effort from those that are really trying to make an impact on the climate movement that are saying, okay, what we need to do is have the CEO step down, for example. But it's not as simple as that. As somebody who's now inside the beast, tell us what it will actually take. And you just did. But how do you actually respond to those who are like, why are you getting involved in the process as opposed to just, from the outside coming up and just saying, absolutely not, just this is what it is.
Right, and I think you phrase it right, that it's not as simple as that. People like to have a binary choice between what's good and bad and so forth. It is not as simple as that. In fact, what's happening with our oil and gas companies is for a long time they've been morphing into energy companies, and we want them to morph even further into carbon molecules management companies. We want them to profit from keeping nature more secure at a faster rate than to profit from extraction and exploitation. It's really sort of that simple. And if they have become that efficient at seismology and subsurface engineering and geology, all these legal entities are really aggregations of intellectual capital. And I can't tell you the amount of young people in management, middle management that are enthusiastic, including the CEO, about being pushed to a faster pace in a new direction. So in just a year's time, we have released the net zero strategy that didn't exist before, a $15 billion budget for low carbon solutions that exceeds the amounts being allocated by the United States government for the same problem of sequestration and a full disclosure in lobbying. And so great strides have been made. There's a great way to go. but it depends on people's engagement and having the faith that your fellow citizens are people of goodwill. They have children too. They believe in their parks and their water and their air to be clean. So it's not as easy as vilifying people.
Sure. And let's face it, most people are still filling up their cars with oil.
Right.
And so it's not going anywhere. How do we reconcile those that are asking or wanting a ban on oil and gas to those everyday decisions that require putting oil in their cars? So how do you think about, or how do you help those who are struggling with that with paradox, really?
Yeah.
How do you talk to them about
Well,
it?
you know, I'm one of your great fans. And one of the reasons I'm one of your great fans is that your title, your mission is about time. And time is the most difficult factor that people fail to integrate into the decision makings of a strategy. You know, and it's easy to say, well, we shouldn't have it. And that's true. We shouldn't have it tomorrow. We shouldn't have it in 5 years. We shouldn't have it in 10. What is the logical order of operations to do this so that we have a just society? This can be very punitive and regressive to people in society. And it's already happening now with 40% inflation that's affecting our food. We've had the UN World Bank meetings this week. Suffering is going on now because of the spike and shock going on in fuel because of this crazy and just war going on, right? So we have disequilibrium in energy markets. And it's not as easy to say, turn the tap off. We've also got to open the aperture on the drain for carbon. We've got to be very deliberate about the carbon we take out of the atmosphere as much as those that we're avoiding sending into the atmosphere. So that's why when people say, well, it's just greenwashing to have a 2050 goal. No, it's not. If you're methodical in your plans and tactics and practical progression to reduce hydrocarbons, to reduce the impact of emissions, and to substitute them credibly with new sources. I've seen a trend. We didn't have a single electric car on the road. We didn't have a single commercial LED light on the shelf when I left office in 2008. What we did have was good, cohesive, bipartisan legislation that President Obama and President Bush agreed on that lasted for 10 years. Didn't account for artificial intelligence, didn't account for the cloud. We barely even had iPhones at that time. So it's time again that we need a 10-year forecast and a plan that moves us forward together. But it really is about time. And there's not time to slow down beginning our action. That's what you're saying. There's an urgency, but there is time to manage ourselves methodically and intelligently to get off the stuff that we don't need to have.
Absolutely. And if anybody can see this overhaul come into reality, it's you with all of the different hats you wear and the roles that you play. And we need this type of passion. We need this type of drive. And individuals sometimes feel that they can't contribute. It seems too much out of their wheelhouse to say, I'm going to be part of this solution because the solutions are as big sounding as what we've been talking about all day today. And now with you is we need to see major overhauls. We need to see the move to clean energy. We need to see bipartisan support behind all of that. What does the average person do to get involved and to feel that they can really be part of the solution? So we just finished up a panel called Investing with Intent because money matters, and where people think about their financial decisions and where to allocate their resources, however much that might be, that matters. That can make a difference. How do you think about where individuals can be part of the solution and where they can really put their money in a way that is going to be most impactful and effective?
It's such a great question. I go one layer deeper because I have 4 daughters. And I worry about a generation that asks themselves that question and ends up with a cynical or skeptical answer. Okay, so it starts with the confidence that we can do something. And betting against the innovation and entrepreneurial spirit of people from the bottom up is a bad bet. Nobody has ever won that bet in this country. So betting on innovation is the right thing to do. Not innovation writ large, I trust all tech and blah, 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 but saying there are can-do solutions, and there are everywhere at every level. They're percolating in every city. So become involved in them, whether it's with social entrepreneurs, whether it's with private entrepreneurs, believe in our capacity to problem solve. I would start there. Then very practically, you can invest in those companies. I was just talking with a gentleman from Sunrun who did very well, right? Obviously, if you're with Tesla, you've done very well. You can believe in those companies. But even our big oil giants, if they're behaving in a way that are showing deliberative transitional plans where we can profit from ridding ourselves of carbon, that can do well in terms of how you use your money. None of it will matter if policymakers in this town don't show up and act responsibly, because the most immediate, most effective, most important, impactful things are things they've taken off the table because of dysfunction. So the number one thing they can do is recharge our democracy and get people to think sensibly about how to clean our air, clean our atmosphere, clean our water.
If you say it loud enough, they might hear you.
You're not far.
We're
not far from the hill.
We are a stone's throw from the hill.
Yeah.
We are walking distance to the White House. This is what I love most about Washington, D.C. We were talking about this yesterday. Everything is walking. So.
Yeah. Well, I would say I was on point for President Bush the last time we had an oil crisis in this country, $147 oil. We are going to that place again. So there is an opportunity for consensus when security, global security and geopolitical disruption meets longer term needs in climate. That's what we had in 2007. And I'm very hopeful that the urgency of all these things, our economic competitiveness, our security, the security of democracy in the world, the security of a world order that's given us a degree of stability to lift people's lives and assets, can blend with the climate message so that we have urgency and we have acceleration and we have justice.
Does that sound like you're coming back to Washington to be part of maybe a future administration to see?
You know, I always serve at the pleasure of a president. I have no ambitions, aspirations, and plans in that way, but there is nobody who I won't help in public office of any party or stripe who has goodwill to try and problem solve.
So today is a really special day, right? We're here because it's Earth Day, obviously, and we are in this really unique time where we are watching a war break out in Europe, and it is a unique time in that it is all of the images and what is happening is being shared. It's really reverberating throughout the world, and the questions are being asked as to what extent individuals are also guilty for partaking in contributing to Putin's war machine, because he's fueled by the profits that have been coming from oil and gas exportations from Russia. How do you think and talk about this?
Well, not speaking for ExxonMobil, but like the other Western oil companies, they have done the right thing with immediacy and divested, right? That's right for us. That doesn't mean that Vladimir Putin becomes poorer. He is actually one of the largest personal beneficiaries of the oil and gas industry. And so the higher that price, the more desperate that situation, the richer that particular despot becomes. And so we have this tragic situation with a land war in Europe for the first time in 77 years that was thought to be unthinkable, Holocaust-like conditions of destroying people in their own homes and schools and railways, etc. So we do have a moral crisis of conscience. And I think many Europeans would say, yes, we are excessively dependent and more dependent than we thought. That has to fuel the urgency. That's what I'm talking about, the great convergence. The urgency you've been helping people think about in terms of scientifically, our habitat loss and the threats we have for climate change are now deeply convergent with our own personal immediate security in the world order that was formed, at the end of World War II. A world order that protected the idea of proliferating democracy and justice. And those things are at risk. So I think you have to blend them together. I don't really have time for blaming and saying, well, Germans, you shouldn't have been on that pipeline 5 and 10 years ago. There's enough pain in the system now. And my bet is if this war persists, it's going to get more painful. So how do we use that stimulus to accelerate faster?
And so these are all solutions, and we think about transforming different industries, how we're going to work with oil and gas and really see some of these innovations come to market and be realized. On the other flip side, there are solutions that are already tried and tested, like planting indigenous trees around the world.
Yes.
And our theme today is nature-based solutions.
Love it.
And so if we can actually distribute and implement existing solutions in accordance with all of the different tools in the toolkit, right?
Yes.
From research and development all the way to discovering of new technologies, and then really just better distributing what's already out there, we can probably realize and meet the urgency where it needs to be met. So how do you think about nature-based solutions as being part of this toolkit?
Well, you and I had no prep for this at all, but that is actually why I'm in Washington this week. Meeting with Andrew Steer from the Bezos Foundation. I just met with Naoko Ishii, the former head of the Global Environmental Facility. I work on a portfolio of technologies that I call Measure the Treasure. We need to have a uniform, universal system of precision accounting that undergirds the ESG movement, that makes these carbon markets, but also biodiversity markets real, not just a series of sequential disaggregated transactions, but a real way to bring nature onto the balance sheet. This, in theory, should be the easiest and first priority of everything we do. As much as we want to engineer geological solutions, man-made solutions to sequester carbon or to utilize carbon, we have the best engineered design ever. Trees, they exist. How do you keep them? How do you reforest them? How do you take care of nature to create the carbon sinks that are intended to be our most useful ally in this most desperate time? So that's actually a passion and priority, and really a heavy priority for my technological investments.
So you really are a proponent of all the solutions. If it's going to be a positive impact on solving this climate crisis, you want to see it through to fruition. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would add to all these nice things you put on my epitaph, he was about urgency.
Right.
So I am not about being mutually exclusive or a zero-sum game. Right. First past the post, and I am desperately prioritizing conservation, because simply doing no harm to nature and facilitating nature's capacity is our first greatest tool. Yes. And if we can't do that, the idea that we can bank on future over-the-horizon solutions becomes a little bit more nebulous. So absolutely all of the above as fast as possible.
Incredible. Okay. I mean, that is exactly the message that we wanted to get out to our audience today, that you are all part of the solution, all of the above, and as fast as possible. Let's make it happen. Thank you so much, Andy. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks for everything you do. You're the best.
So thank you to Andy, who has joined us for in person here in Washington, D.C. And we are going to queue up a video from one of our partners, NCX. Please enjoy.
My family's been interested in carbon credits and in environmental protection for many, many years. We've read a lot about carbon credits, but never found a program that worked for us until we found this one.
It's a win-win for the environment, win for the landowner, economically down the road, and that is exactly what this program allows us to do, is to keep the trees growing and have some yearly income as well.
A lot of up-and-coming research shows a lot about what clear cutting actually does to the forest. The forest needs to be managed with thinning and with open spaces, and we do need to generate some revenue. Then this is an optimal way to do that without actually destroying anything.
From companies that connect corporations to landowners for the purchase of carbon credits, to another partner of ours that recently visited the United States to discuss the significant opportunities in circularity. Let's watch Linnea Selberg, business analyst at Rang Cells and third generation of this family-run company that was established initially as a horse transport firm in 1881 before transforming into a waste management company, which is now at the forefront of a sustainable 21st century. Here is Linnea at the UN representing Rang Cell, who was specially invited for a prep meeting ahead of Stockholm Plus 50.
If we are serious about creating a sustainable world,
We have to start using the raw materials we have already extracted over and over again. But that is not how the world works today. At the Stockholm Conference in 1972, there was already some focus on the nitrogen problem that we have created for ourselves. Today, 50 years later, the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycles are so out of balance that we are way above the planetary boundaries defined by science. Hundreds of millions of children suffer from stunted growth and impaired brain development because of nitrogen overload in their local water. At the same time, more than 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the burning of fossil gas to produce nitrogen fertilizer. We cannot go on like this. My great-grandfather started a horse and cart business in 1881, which over time developed into a waste management and recycling company. This shift was driven by my grandfather, who summed up the driving force behind it when he said, "I believe that the world is too beautiful to perish." Our family business has operated on this belief ever since. Today, we at Ragn-Sells offer circular methods for producing the 3 key nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Wastewater from our growing cities contain massive amounts of phosphorus and nitrogen, and we have the technology to capture them at the wastewater treatment plant and put them to new use on our fields. This way, the wastewater treatment plants of today can become the resource plants of tomorrow, producing the nutrients that we need to grow our food. This way, we don't have to burn all that gas to produce nitrogen fertilizer or mine as much phosphate tainted with cadmium. But this requires a global effort for a new legislation which supports circularity. As a 4th-generation businesswoman, I want to contribute to a world where we use the raw materials we already have, because I do believe that the world is too beautiful to let it perish. And if you share this belief, it is time to act on it now and start paving the way for circularity.
Beautiful words to remember and live by from Linnea. We're going to now move to an encore presentation of our special episode filmed here in our DC studio with Ragn-Sells. Enjoy. We are lucky to have 2 key members of the team here in Washington, D.C., where they are on a whistle-stop tour of America to share their ideas and what they are doing. Par Larshans is my co-host for today's special episode and is Ragn-Sells' head of sustainability and, among many other things, an advisor to 2 Swedish ministries. Linnea Sellberg is a product leader at Ragn-Sells and is a 3rd generation of this family-run company that was established initially as a horse transport firm in 1881 before transforming into a waste management company, which is now at the forefront of a sustainable 21st century. And finally with us is Eva Hunius-Olin from the Swedish Embassy here in DC. You know, Eva, I'm actually a proud MLP fellow at the Atlantic Council and affiliated with the Global Energy Center. So the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center and the Europe Center, in partnership with the United States Department of Energy and Embassy of Sweden, are to launch the U.S.-Sweden Green Transition Initiative to discuss opportunities for the U.S. and Sweden to accelerate the energy transition. Eva, I'm looking forward to having you speak to the Green Transition Initiative and the circular economy. But before we start, I would like to ask viewers to download the We Don't Have Time app at wedon'thavetime.org. Here you can ask questions of today's guests and leave reviews about this show or any other topic of interest and become part of our 60,000 plus strong community that is generating over 50 million a month in social engagement. Join us in conversation. So to kick things off, let me start with you first, Linnea. Tell us a little bit about why you and Par are here in the United States.
We are here because at Ragn-Sells we have technology to recycle nutrients and truly bring that part of our society into a circular economy. but there are limits to what we can do because the whole society we live in is based on a legislation made for a linear economy where waste is something bad. So we are here to talk about the importance of recycling resources, and even if it comes from waste, to recognize that it can actually be a better quality and better for the environment and for our health to just recycle what we already have.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with our audience. Par, please comment as well.
Yeah, and already back in 2018, we were invited by UN to present at the high-level political forum on the theme Innovation and Leadership for the SDGs. And that was because of our phosphorus innovation. This year, we have been invited to be part of the UN Stockholm Plus 50 activity in New York. And today it was our nitrogen initiative that are really in focus. So both phosphorus and nitrogen are crucial for food production going forward. And we can source it in a circular way, not produce it with today's heavy emitter of carbon emissions.
I am so excited to get more into this. And before we do, Eva, would you like to just tell us a little bit about this, this initiative that you're launching?
Sure. It's a joint initiative by the Embassy of Sweden in Washington, D.C., together with Business Sweden, the Swedish Energy Agency, and the Swedish Innovation Agency, Vinnova. We do this because we want to be part of the U.S. climate transition. We see a much more ambitious climate agenda in the United States. We believe Sweden and the US have a lot of things to share and benefit by working together. We, of course, want to contribute to lower the global emissions, but we also want to increase R&D collaboration, trade and investments between the United States and Sweden.
Fantastic. Well, we have a lot to talk about. I feel as though we should probably sit down to have the longer conversation. So let's move to a more comfortable setting. Thank you all. Hello again. Now that we are comfortably seated, we can really get into this conversation. So let's talk about the company, your company, Regen. What is it you do, and why is it that nitrogen compounds are so important to our planet?
The understanding is that if we start with a problem in the world, nitrogen is one of the few things that are really critical when it comes to the planetary boundaries, our challenge. And we don't really know what's going to happen if we are already today over the threshold where we cannot go back anymore. But nitrogen is one of the really critical subjects that we need to make sure that we can avoid to continue the use the way that we're doing today. So nitrogen needs to be taken care of in a different way. Regen, we have been a waste management company, but understood in 2015 that we needed to transform, because in the future circular economy, there's no waste. And therefore we then made sure that we did innovate things that we can be part of the future circular economy. And our nitrogen solution is one of them.
Why do we need to be that concerned about nitrogen, though?
Well, the challenge is that today, nitrogen, if it emits into our oceans or our rivers, it causes eutrophication. If it comes into our freshwater, it causes problem for health. I know hundreds of millions of kids around the world in the developing countries, they are suffering from the problem with the nitrogen. So the nitrogen is one of a really health problem as well as it is an environmental problem. Because when nitrogen are emitted back to the atmosphere, it's mainly done through laughing gas, nitrogen dioxide, and it's a huge climate gas. So it's bad for the climate, bad for the health, and of course, much needed at the same time for food production.
I mean, this is the issue, right? Is that we think of nitrogen as laughing gas. How harmful can that be? But actually, this is something we really need to make aware to the public and to policymakers so we can get behind some of the innovative solutions that your company is putting forward. So Linnea, somebody third generation in this company, this is in your family, this is in your blood. Tell us a little bit, what have you developed and why is this of interest, especially here in the US?
We have technology today to recycle both nitrogen that we have already talked about and phosphorus from sewage sludge. And these are two of the three key nutrients to produce food. We need phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium, and we can actually recycle all of these resources, the phosphorus and the nitrogen from wastewater, and the potassium from ashes from incinerated waste. And this is it's really important for the phosphorus and the potassium. They're limited resources, and it's only a handful of countries that produce these resources today. So we are very dependent on Russia, for example. And if we can produce these resources locally within our country, we can reduce our dependence on these countries, as well as secure food production.
So this is actually a food security issue that your solutions are addressing, in addition to so many other aspects like preserving biodiversity, agriculture, but really security globally. So go ahead, Par, please.
I can give you one quick example from Sri Lanka. At the COP26, we were participating and did showcase these innovations. And there I met with the Minister of Environment from Sri Lanka, and they had just made a decision to stop the import of nutrients from China. They would like to be independent. At the same time, they needed nutrients for their food production. So they really try to do whatever they can in an ecological way. But they were really interested in our nitrogen solution, because then they can use their future wastewater treatment plants as a resource treatment plants going forward. So suddenly, the independence are extremely important, but at the same time, they need to produce the food. So this is not a technique just for developed countries, also for all countries around the world.
So since we're on this global security issue and the independence and sovereignty of nations, this is something that Atlantic Council, as a fellow of the Atlantic Council, I'm very aware, cares about. And let me bring you into this conversation, Eva. So you're launching an initiative with the Atlantic Council, really talking about this green transition. How do you see collaboration between multilateral institutions, policymakers across all levels, from local to multilateral, and innovative companies like Rangcells being critical to actually seeing through this green transition?
Yes, no, very key. We cannot meet our ambitions on our own. Sweden is in the forefront of sustainability. We hosted the first UN Environment Conference back in 1972, and we're celebrating that this year in June with Stockholm Plus 50. That is, of course, a multilateral global forum where we bring stakeholders like companies, but also, of course, the countries together and to talk about these solutions and how to become sustainable in the future. Very interesting what I've heard from Per and Linnea this morning about this independence, need of independence, and that we are dependent on these countries that has become even more critical these last few weeks. So of course working together is key. And this Green Transition Initiative is, between Sweden and the US. But that is how we can work together. Maybe we can bring in circular economy issues into this initiative.
And you're both actually talking about all of this as part of Stockholm Plus 50 as well. As you mentioned in the introduction, you are here for a pre-Stockholm Plus 50 conference in New York City at the United Nations. Tell us a little bit about why a relationship with this type of organization is critical to seeing your solutions into commercial viability.
I think that Linnea has really a very nice statement to put here, why she believes this is important for the future.
Okay. Well, today we live in a linear society where all the legislation is made to prevent pollution from waste, but we need to move into a circular economy. If we really want to create a sustainable world, we actually have to start using the resources that we have already extracted over and over again. And that's why we're here today, because we need to get the word out that we need to change the way the world works today. We need to change the legislation to support circularity. And that's the only way we can actually make use of these resources.
And some of these concepts, unless you studied chemistry in college, might be over our policymakers' heads. So how do you talk about these in a way that is really going to resonate so that you can see appropriate policy support for your solutions? How have you been speaking to policymakers about this?
Do you want to?
Yeah, this is my favorite theme, and I would like to address the policymakers here now. It's extremely important to understand that you are the key here. If you can make sure that you put the demand of phosphorus recovery as an example, it will mean that we will start the circular transformation. But you also need to allow that it's possible to use. Because to be honest, in Europe, we can produce a really high quality phosphorus that is perfect for as a feed phosphate, but we're not allowed to use it because legislation say, well, origin determinates not the quality. If it has mined resource with high pollutions, with high carbon emissions, it's okay. But with a low carbon emitter, with a much higher quality, you're not allowed to use it. So I agree with Linnea. We need to make a mind shift, and you policymakers need to make a mind shift and understand there is technique available out there, and it will reduce in the end the cost for the wastewater treatment plants as well. So it's good for the money as well for the society.
And from your position, Eva, at the Swedish Embassy, do you appreciate some of the challenges here that Par and Linnea are confronting when it comes to communicating these solutions to policymakers? What sort of public-private partnerships are really needed to solve what is a bigger climate crisis? This is one impact. Food security issues, food and agriculture is one impact of climate change. And we have solutions. We just need to see them actually materialize. So how do you think about public-private partnerships in terms of supporting collaboration and innovation?
Again, that is one reason why we're doing this Sweden-US Green Transition Initiative, because we see there is a need to help innovative technologies like what ranked cells have to get to the market. And that's why we're putting some money into this initiative, and we'll be supporting this initiative for 3 years with some local people here in Washington, but also in California, where we see there is a very progressive agenda going forward within this space. We do have, we work as an embassy, we work both on federal level, trying to learn what the Americans are doing when it comes to, could be, circular economy, recycling issues. I know they came out with a new strategy back in November, and more upcoming on certain areas, and we're following that closely. As you may know, we have our own circular strategy from Sweden from 2020 that we are trying to communicate with the Americans, to tell them about what are we doing, trying to teach them a little bit what we're doing and see if they want to follow Sweden's lead when it comes to this. And as I said, California, we have a bilateral agreement with the state of California. We see that a lot of the waste recycling issues are not maybe managed or ruled on a federal level, but rather on a municipality and state level. So we try to engage with them on city and state level. And I know California specifically has reached out to Sweden to talk about circular economy issues. So hopefully we can work with that and maybe bring cells.
I can give a very concrete example from 2018 when I was in New York the last time at UN. I also met with the city of New York then, and they really expressed about their problems with how they should treat the sewage sludge after 2030. They are now landfilling or landscaping, depending on how you see it. But to be honest, they're wasting the resources. And so our example is that if we use our technique, you don't need to landfill anymore. You can extract all the resources that can come back. And of course, the most valuable thing are the phosphorus. So we do have a solution for the megacities, for New York, for Washington, even if Washington maybe not, it's a big city, but not a megacity. It's also perfect fitted here.
So, okay, are you noticing that there are some certain cities and states that are ahead of the curve a little bit from your experiences? Where would you like to see a little bit more action here in the US and around the world?
I think you already mentioned California on the forefront. We do see that New York is also really on the forefront when it comes to environmental issues. But it really is very, very, it really depends from state or from city to city. It's really, really, really differs a lot. So it's much, much easier when it comes to the Europe, because then you have national legislations. So it is better. It's easier, not better. It's easier in Europe.
Let's talk about the big picture. I'm going to get back to talking about calcium carbonate and oil shale ash because it's fascinating. And those who are anticipating a deep dive during this table talk, you will not be disappointed. But while we're on this big picture, let's talk about how waste flows can bring back valuable resources while helping with all of the aspects of climate, right? We have to connect this back to the reality of what we are collectively experiencing, which is the planet is warming. And we need to really think about biodiversity loss and pollution. How do you describe this in the context of that big picture? I'd love to hear from all three of you, starting with Park.
I can start. When it comes to circular material flows, science has proved that if we really can create circular material flows, we will not only fulfill the ambition set in the Paris Agreement, we'll also reduce the risk to overshoot any of the planetary boundaries. So that's a fact. But of course, where should you start? I believe you should start where the resources are much needed. And the situation now with the food crisis that will come during to what's happening in Ukraine, we do see the challenge. We need to focus on food, is my opinion. And of course, phosphorus. And tomorrow, we can't wait.
Go ahead, Linnea, please.
Sorry, what was the question again?
The question was, how do you think of the unique solutions that you have put forward in the context of the bigger picture? So why is this relevant for the planet warming and how the implications for biodiversity loss and pollution?
Yeah. When we're talking about nutrients, we talk a lot about the recycling part and about making use of the resources, but it's not just producing resources, it's also like when we take the nitrogen at a wastewater treatment plant, we clean the water, we're producing clean water and we can produce clean food, which is better for our health. When we use the recycled phosphorus, we don't get the cadmium pollution that's in the freshly mined phosphorus, which is better for our bones, less health issues. And it's always like that with recycling. It's two-sided. We get resources and we save pollution, which is good for our health and for the environment. If you look at nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, that produces eutrophication and pollutes our oceans. So that's a big part of it as well.
These nutrients can have detrimental effects on the environment, but ultimately, if recycled, can really be maximized, their fullest potential, because we need these nutrients. They're critical to human health and planetary health. They just need to be recycled in a way where we really all win, right? The planet, animals, and humans.
Yeah, it's a win-win. We save the greenhouse gas emissions, we get rid of pollution, and we get better health.
Okay, well, you've definitely
What's wrong with
I've
that?
learned something here. Yes, you've definitely convinced me. How do you think about this, Eva?
I guess I should echo Linnea and Per. As I said earlier, Sweden has very high ambitions when it comes to sustainability, and we want to be one of the first fossil-free welfare states. In order to become fossil-free, we need to transition to a circular economy. And it sounds like in order to face all environmental challenges and also get the economic benefits, it sounds from these kind of technologies, that's a win-win. So we need to transition to a circular economy to get these environmental benefits and the economic benefits going forward.
Okay, I mean, this is called Circular Table Talks, but if we haven't convinced you on the importance of circular economies across all sectors, then we're just going to keep having our circular table talks until we get there. So before we end, I really would like to hear more about calcium carbonate and oil shale ash. These are, again, terms that if you're not working in the space might not be too familiar to you, but obviously have significant consequences on our planet. So please do share with our audience.
Yeah, Sveta, what we touch upon today are innovations that also are very suited to use here in the US. The phosphorus and the nitrogen are for the wastewater treatment plants. The potassium is based on that we can use our waste to energy plants here in US, and so they can become circular. But when it comes to oil shale energy production, it exists in Utah today. And we have a project now where we have innovated a solution in Estonia, where we'll use what has been stockpiled since the 60s from the old Soviet Union energy production. And 600 million tons of ashes are stockpiled in the north of Narva. And we have a technique where we can extract the calcium oxide out of the ashes, but add on carbon dioxide as an input, and then produce precipitated calcium carbonate, needed in floorings, needed in paintings. And we have a company here in US, Tarkett, a flooring company, that are a partner to us on a global level, because they would like to change how they source the calcium carbonate going forward. They would like to source it in this case, a climate negative way. So it's possible to use the ashes to produce carbon negative raw material that are much needed and replace today's virgin production. So what we touched upon today, the calcium carbonate, there is a possibility going forward in Utah to go circular with that as well. There is a possibility for all wastewater treatment plants in the US to use the technique that we talked about with phosphorus and nitrogen. And of course, if you have using waste to energy plants, you should go circular. And then we have a technique for that as well.
I am so excited to see these solutions come into fruition. What do we need to see what do we need to make that happen ultimately? What are the challenges we still need to overcome here?
We need to have policymakers to understand that it's possible. We need to have the rulers, the presidents of the countries to do that. And I would like to end with a small film with the president, the prime minister, and the EU commissioner speaking about our innovation, our OSA project, the Estonian project. So you can see it. It was a documentary that was broadcast the same day as the heads of states met at the COP26. But I won't give you the 45-minute version. You will just have the 1-minute version where you can see a statement from the Prime Minister of Estonia, the President, but also the EU Commissioner about Ragn-Sells innovations.
That's a fantastic way to cue up the film. Thank you so much to each of you for being here in Washington, D.C., being part of the UN Stockholm Plus 50 event, which is coming up in June in Stockholm, and for taking the time to visit our We Don't Have Time headquarters in Washington, D.C. for this special episode of Circular Table Talks. We are thrilled to have hosted you, and we can't wait to see these really critical innovations reach their fullest potential. So we hope you've been out there listening carefully, policymakers, and thank you for educating our global user base and public as well to get a little bit more knowledge on maybe some concepts that they haven't encountered in a while. I know I've learned a lot. Thank you very much to each of you.
Thank you.
You don't have to believe in climate change. You only have to know that all your partners, trading partners, the ones with whom you trade in services as well, they simply will not buy goods and services which are produced not in a clean way.
We have a saying, those who are late will get nothing. We don't want to be left behind. We want to find Estonian niche where we could be strong, where we could be #1 in the world.
This ultra-pure and carbon-neutral calcium carbonate are produced of oil shale ash remains after electricity production.
What is very nice is that we are using 2 waste streams, the ash and the calcium from it, and also CO2. And we put them together, and we have a fantastic product for the market. Something that is used in everyday items, calcium carbonate.
This is precisely the purpose of Ragn-Sells project, turning the old heaps of oil shale ash into a useful chemical component with captured CO2. It is a great example of carbon circularity.
Thank you to our global audience who tuned in today and engaged with us. Over 10 million viewers as we close out this program on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2022. It's been a tremendous day of programming, and we have talked about everything, critical conversations around Ukraine and the environment, to nature-based solutions, and how we can usher in a circular economy to really realize the fullest potential of our shared planet that we live on. To those of you who have supported us, thank you. To those of you who contributed or may have contributed to the effort to take down our feed today, we will always ensure that the truth prevails. We are not going to shy away from having the tough conversations and talking about the reality of what we are facing here in the United States, in Washington, D.C., and around the world, what our brothers and sisters in Ukraine are going through, and what we need to do as a global collective to really ensure that humanity is experiencing the fullest of potential in their lives, as well as the environment that we call home. So thank you to all of you who have tuned in, and to those of you who attempted to keep us down. We will continue to spread truth and information around the climate crisis and what we need to do to come together to solve it, because together we truly are the solution to the climate crisis. Thank you to our partners, Mercer, Rank Cells, and earthday.org. It was a fantastic program here out from Washington, D.C., and we continue to wish all of you, wherever you are around the world, a fantastic Earth Day. Thank you.